Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to SC Dawah Live. Today we're going to be doing a debate review between Professor Graham Oppy and our own Abdullah Andalusi. And I thought it would be a great idea to do it because the debate just took place on Friday. So firstly, Assalamu alaikum, Abdullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
How are you doing, brother?
You're interviewing me even before the sweat has dried, so to speak.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah? Okay.
That's a good way of beginning the topic. So just before we get into it, guys, I think it's important for us to highlight who exactly Abdullah was debating, because one thing which fascinated me about this discussion was the caliber of the opponent. So Professor Graham Oppy is an Australian philosopher whose main area of research is philosophy of religion. He currently holds the posts of Professor of Philosophy and Associate Dean of Research at Monash University in Australia, and serves as the CEO of the Australian Association of Philosophy. And then he's the chief editor of the Australasian Philosophical Review, associate editor of the Australasian Journal of Philosophy, and on and on and on. And this guy is actually a very well-respected, well-known academic, and somebody who, sometimes when their opponents, having these sort of discussions and stuff, they may not know anything about Islam, or they may not be nuanced or whatever. But Professor Oppy is actually a very good, opponent from that perspective. He's quite nuanced. He's quite. I was actually surprised during the debate that he was quite in tune with Ottoman history, and he brought up some examples and stuff. So Abdullah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some of the things which you mentioned in the debate, and then ask you to speak about them in a bit more detail. So I think the first thing which is important is you went up first, and you actually spoke about the definition of liberalism.
That I'm just before we can discuss what flows out of those terms, and how it relates to the world today. So in essence, liberalism, kind of in a nutshell, is the political liberalism or secular liberalism. In a nutshell, concerns the prioritization of the individual above all other political concerns. Human being being the most important or most preeminent value over state, society, religion, or any other higher narratives. At least this is the official, you could say, or a particular stream of the definitions of liberalism. That's in theory. Some people might say in practice it means the harm principle, so that everyone should be allowed to do what they want by the state as long as they don't harm people, or people should be given, another definition is people should be given as much rights as possible, as much freedoms as possible, up to the equal freedoms of other people. The key term is as much as possible, and there's a big discussion as to what that means, what is possible, and what is prudent as well. So that's kind of liberalism. Some might say that liberalism doesn't really offer any higher narrative. It's just a pragmatic means of organizing political societies in the presence of, let's say, competing ideas of what is good. Although many of the liberal thinkers did suggest what is good, or they tried to define it, because if the state is going to allow everyone to pursue what is good and make laws against what is bad, it needs to have its own definition of what is good and bad. And so the state now has to adopt some particular definition. So in essence, that's kind of the creed of liberalism summated.
Okay, so just on this point, I thought it was important to, obviously in a debate, you first go over definitions, you first go over what each term means, because that obviously dictates the wider discussion you're going to have. But one thing which you highlighted right at the beginning was the fact that there is no conception of good, or there is no higher meaning. And later on in the debate, you also spoke about why there's no holy book and there's many different types of liberalism. Why was that important for you to highlight right from the onset?
Okay, so you could say, I mean, this was just so people can understand. So initially, the event was meant to be a debate, and it was meant to be a debate on, again, the title was the same, so Islam or liberalism, which one is better for humanity? And it was initially, they asked me to, the Macquarie University Muslim Student Association asked me to be a participant for the Muslim side, and they hadn't actually yet found someone who could speak for the liberal side. And then they finally found someone. They told me it was Dr. Graham Oppy, and I was very interested by this, but I thought he doesn't usually talk about political philosophy. I have no doubt, and I'm actually now assured, even after speaking to him, that he certainly knows about it. He certainly has read about it, but it's just not the thing that he does public debates about. He usually talks to Christians about theism and God and the philosophy of religion and problem, evil, and things like that. Something I would like to maybe discuss with him in future. However, upon agreeing to this, and I kind of proceeded to state some cases about what, how we would measure this question. How do you measure the question, Islam or liberalism? Well, according to who? According to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Well, it's not going to be liberalism then. But according to an atheist who doesn't believe in God, well, of course, it's not going to be Islam. So then how do we decide this question? And the only way it can be decided is, in essence, through the looking at what it means by better for humanity. And again, better is subjective. What does it mean by better? And therefore, the only way to fully, you could say, answer this in the most objective sense is to show which one is consistent and kind of can actually deal with the human problems, and which one is inconsistent, internally inconsistent and inconsistent with human nature. So based on that strategy of consistency, in essence, and as we all know, anything that is not from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala contains much inconsistency within it. So it's the gold standard for measuring falsehood is lack of consistency. So I based my opening presentation, or you could say opening strategy, on 5 major points. The first point was that Islam.
Sorry, just before we get into that, I just want to play the clip where Professor Oppy gives his definition of liberalism, and then we can go into the presentation itself. So I'm just going to share the screen again. And
Right, Abdullah. Professor Oppy, I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, so there's a lot in what was just said, and it would probably be useful to pick over some of it sort of bit by bit. So I think that the way to think about liberalism from the kind of high-level standpoint that you're thinking about it is that we start with the supposition that society is going to contain lots of people who have different comprehensive conceptions of the good. So there are going to be people who have different religious conceptions. There are going to be people who have different non-religious conceptions. And we know before we start that there are not going to be arguments that are going to persuade people who have one particular comprehensive conception of the good to swap to another. There's no argument strong enough to bring about convergence amongst people, agreement on what's the correct comprehensive conception of the good. And so the thing that the liberal state is designed to do is to allow people with different comprehensive conceptions of the good to live together. And the way that this works, which Abdullah, I think, correctly described, is to suppose that the best that we can do is to allow each person as much freedom in pursuing their particular comprehensive conception of the good as is consistent with allowing everybody else that same degree of freedom in pursuing their comprehensive conception of the good. Now, it's not the case either that this means that liberalism entails a kind of atomistic individualism or that it entails a kind of nihilism, right? what matters, whether people are nihilists or not, is going to be their own comprehensive conception of the good. Whether people are community-minded or individual or not is going to depend again on their comprehensive conception of the good. And most people, if you think about the kinds of things that they're going to value, they're going to rightly value friendship, they're rightly going to value love, they're rightly going to value family, they're rightly going to value having meaningful projects to pursue in their lives, and on and on. There's a whole lot of things, and the expectation is that the liberal state is going to facilitate people in pursuing all of those things. And so,
yeah, I mean, it goes on. I mean, I don't want to play the whole thing, but one thing which came across straight away in the definitions was that there was, I mean, obviously he agreed with your definition, but at the same time, he also broadened it from the perspective that there is no one comprehensive conception of the good. And yeah, I mean, he also spoke a little bit about, I think it was nihilism, right? How it doesn't lead to a type of nihilism and this type of thing. So just on this point of definitions, because it was such a long debate, and I think it's important first to see how much there was agreement on the definitions before we get into the actual argument itself.
Okay, well, firstly, I kind of discussed and defined liberalism during my opening presentation, and as you heard, he agreed with my definition of liberalism. Someone thought that we argued on the definition of liberalism. We didn't. He actually agreed. I made sure to represent it in at least the three of the top formulas of how it's represented, how liberalism is defined by its adherents, to ensure as much coverage as possible, so that at least one of those definitions he would agree with and he would accept, and he did. He didn't actually, to be honest, he didn't actually really kind of put forward anything which my opening kind of presentation didn't really address, with the exception that he mentioned that people can't agree on like how you're going to solve the problem of like the non-convergence, right? So there's no convergence of people all agreeing on the same idea. And I posited in my opening presentation that liberalism's very naive understanding of human beings thinks that it can let everyone play in the sandpit and think that they will play nicely, if only people just don't perhaps punch each other or something. But there's quite a lot of things you can do in the sandpit, like to use the kind of a nursery metaphor, digging holes for people to fall into is one. Building big sand walls where other people can't get to the other half of the sandpit because you built a massive wall there. Just to kind of let the analogy run wild here, but it really emphasizes that beyond actual physical harm, there's actually quite a lot going on with humans messing with other humans, as they say. And really just to kind of, I just want to kind of, in a way, summate my opening presentation, because it defines the entire debate. You're understanding the entire debate through the opening presentation. So the first point really was simply that Islam is a holistic system. It combines a meaning, purpose of life with actual humans' day-to-day problems, issues, resolving those issues, living a full, holistic and mentally non-compartmentalized life. So everything is integrated in everything else harmoniously. That's the first thing. So from an epistemological basis, it's holistic and harmonious and fully consistent with both your beliefs to how you practice it on the ground, to how society works, the goods that society aims for. So that's one thing that I compared to liberalism, so that liberalism doesn't offer any higher meaning at all. Now, Oppy thought, in his response there, he thought that I was trying to say that liberalism entails nihilism, or entails atomism. I know that he was going to say, I knew that he might say such things if I was to make such claims, but one could argue that, like in Japan, people aren't entirely as atomistic as people in the West, but Japan is a secular liberal state. So that wasn't going to be my argument at all. But I think he thought I was going to say that. I merely posited that liberalism itself, as a worldview and ideology, is not as holistic as Islam. That's literally all I was saying. He thought I was saying a bigger point than I actually was. So that's one thing. The second thing was the second point of my argument was that Islam understands human nature and organizes individuals and societies, not just only individuals, not just only society, like maybe some socialisms, but actually so individuals and society to be in a harmonious, non-self-defeating, non-self-destructive kind of coexistence. So that's in essence, so Islam understands human nature and it tries to create harmony amongst human beings, not actually but to let them basically fight it out with each other as long as they don't use fists. And then the last 2 points in my opening presentation. So one, I discussed liberalism's definition, the same as Oppy just mentioned, and as he also reaffirmed that I said, which I said was correct. And I said that it starts out, the solution it brings to the problem of non-convergence is based on a false ontology of humans, the false understanding of human beings, which is that humans are just individuals that don't affect each other. And I argue that they do affect each other. They're built to affect each other. They're built to be sociable. They're built to imitate each other. That's what they do. So if you let society run wild and let the strong, the influencers who might be corruptors have full reign to influence, make negative influences, or the rich capitalists full reign to dispose of their wealth as they see fit and monopolize the market, you're going to have people who don't have access to resources and so on. So that was the penultimate point. And the final point is that liberalism, then the consequence of this is liberalism organizes society the wrong way. And it is ambiguous. So when it says society, that liberalism, in essence, my definition was will give as much freedom as possible, equal to the freedom of everybody else. The question is what is possible, and I asked the question, what is prudent, as well. So because liberalism doesn't look at society, at least its the initial kind of forms of it, and then it tried to preserve the freedoms that it first concocted should be the case from its original form. It has systematically failed to prevent socially corrupting forces and also socially oppressing forces that also manifest into like capitalism and wealth distribution, which we can discuss later. So those are my basic points of my opening presentation as to why Islam was better and why liberalism is simply not better, because it's not consistent, and it has an inaccurate view of humans and has consequent discordances amongst its solutions when applied to humans.
Yeah. And I think overall it was very clear what you were trying to say. I think something that stood out for me right at the beginning, before we went into each of these arguments, was the way that you presented the false ontological premise of liberalism, the whole Hobbesian view and whatnot. So I just want to play with that part and extrapolate this point, because I felt that if this was pretty much the only point that was made in the debate, and if it wasn't responded to, I think that's enough of a reason for liberals to rethink their philosophy, because it's almost taken for granted by them that, this is just the way things are. But the way you presented it there, I thought was quite thoughtful. So I'm just going to go to that section. Naveed, if you could just bring up the screen again, please.
Now, here's the issue. Liberalism posits that humans are independent. They used to say that they have a natural right to freedom based on what they would like before they came into society. So humans were like individuals in the wild, roaming around as individuals in perfect freedom. But because they feared violence from each other, they formed societies and made a social contract. The issue is that never really corresponded with what we can see from anthropology and ancient human beings. And so what we find is that the model which you could say the first liberal thinkers based their system on is inaccurate when it comes to human beings. The ontology is wrong. Humans have lived in family units, extended family units, sometimes up to 30 people in a kind of self-supporting system. They were taught language, they were taught skills and they were cultured, and they were taught the beliefs of their particular clan or kind of nomadic group. And this has always been humans. Humans have never been individuals roaming around in the wild by themselves. So the entire premise of liberalism was based on trying to restore that natural right, you could say, to human beings. They used to be free as individuals before, so now we're going to try and make them as free as possible in this political state, for them to do whatever they want, because they're naturally individuals. Whereas, as we know, humans, if you look at both the human psychology and sociology, we certainly, and what we have something called sociology is because humans are not actually only individuals, but we interrelate, and a lot of our own identity, our way of thinking, tastes is shaped by society, including our ability to speak languages. So that's the issue. That's the problem with the liberal ontology. The Islamic ontology.
Okay, so firstly, I think just on this point, I don't remember Professor Oppy responding at all to this, but I think it's obviously because you were you had to be concise because of time limitations. You didn't, for a layperson audience, lay out what exactly is the Hobbesian view, the social contract, and the link between liberalism and individualism, right? So maybe if you can go into that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, so you're right. Oppy didn't, Dr. Oppy didn't address that fundamental flaw in the basis of liberalism. He didn't address the arguments that I showed, and I give loads of examples which we will go through, to show the negative social influences that lead to discordant human personalities and life experiences, which we otherwise know as unhappiness, right? Stress and happiness, and then its attendant things like anxiety and depression. So he didn't deal with those things. He didn't touch those things. His strategy, I believe, was he thought that there's a very simple argument that he's going to make. And the argument is Islam has differences of opinion amongst Muslims, or not everyone's a Muslim as well. So there's differences. You can't reconcile a society which is mixed of Muslims, non-Muslims, and maybe he was trying to allude to Muslims too. And the second pillar of his argument was, whatever you think of liberalism, it's the most pragmatic solution for the convergence problem, or the non-convergence of human agreement. That was he came in as a philosopher. He didn't come in as someone bringing empirical facts and figures from the application of liberalism in Western societies. So he wasn't. I didn't feel he was prepared to engage any of those arguments. He just thought he had a very simple formulas as a philosopher he would, and that's what he was going to basically deal with. He's not going to deal with anything else. He's just going to thought, if I can just get those two things presented from my case, I should be able to effectively make the strong case for liberalism. It didn't pan out, I think, as he imagined, because I then went to target those two pillars specifically. Now, admittedly, when I'm discussing Islamic law, I don't want to get bogged down too much in discussing difference of opinion, all the intricacies of Islamic fiqh and jurisprudence, which would have made my my time that I had needed to respond even longer, and it would have been unwieldy. So in essence, I just posited something that Muslims, I think, really should know. And Muslims don't really realize this compared to any other way of life or political ideology or religion. Muslims agree on more things than any other religion and way of life that is out there, from the traditional and mainstream or majority religions and political ideologies. We agree in so much. The very fact that we, like all Muslims, we pray 5 times a day. The skeletal structure of the amount of rakahs we do, all right, is all the same. We all agree on it, unless you're a so-called ex-Muslim, and then you might believe that what was that joke meme about how many rakahs is Fatiha or something? So anyway, which is of course 2 according to many of these ex-Muslims. So we agree on that. That's already far ahead than Christianity. The fact that we all pray the same, no matter whether you're whatever school of thought you are, Sunni or even in the Shia schools. And then you've got, what about our political fiqh? Well, the fact that we all believe in the general hudud, the aspect of the punishment for zina, we all it's standard agreement across all schools of thought. No school of thought denies this. Many other laws, prohibition of drinking khamar. There's some slight differences as to what khamar means, but the understanding that intoxicant or something khamar that is khamar should be prohibited is generally agreed upon, or even by the majority, at the very least argument we can make. These are very basic things. Zakah redistribution system, we agree on. So there's so many things, and that's because of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's life. The thing that is the most well noted and the thing that we can be the most certain on, apart from the Quran and mutawat narrations, his public speeches, but is actually how he ruled, because this was the same. This is the thing that his Sahabas then took forward as the model of rulership. To give you an analogy from a, let's say, a public figure more recent in time, where there was more right, Napoleon Bonaparte. What do we know more about Napoleon Bonaparte? His military campaigns, his political campaigns, what his reforms in France, or do we know more about his personal life? What do you know more about Napoleon Bonaparte? You're going to be knowing what he did publicly because everyone saw what he did publicly, right? So, with the Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, one of the earliest seerah literature of the Rasul was the Maghazi literature. His military campaigns was the earliest seerah literature. So anyway, that was something that I didn't fully elaborate on, but I simply mentioned that Muslims, we have more agreement on the political sharia than any other way of life, ideology, and what have you. And then the second pillar of Oppy's argument that he probably wasn't expecting, was because he thought that it would just be a straight up his definition of liberalism versus any critiques I might bring, which is that there are multiple schools of thought within liberalism and within the Western Enlightenment, which there is no agreement on any aspect of liberalism you can think of. Any aspect, fiscal policy, social policy, family, abortion, everything, there is absolutely no agreement on anything you can think of. So that's why they have these political parties to help try to conform, get some movement going in particular directions and set a particular standardized agenda to get some policies through. And of course, the argument is, if you don't support this political party, then the other major madhab, the conservatives or whoever, are going to get into power. So you might as well support us, the left-wingers. And these kind of arguments are generally made. So those are the two pillars that Oppy, I feel, based his entire debate strategy on. And those are the two pillars that I basically targeted. Obviously, with more of an emphasis on refuting liberalism, the basis that he uses to justify liberalism, it's pragmatic justification, and mainly because I think Muslims needed to see this primarily because many Muslims would make arguments that they don't fully understand liberalism, so their arguments are not always hitting the mark. But if you know where the bodies are buried, right, then you can know where to direct, where you can point them out, and that's precisely what I endeavored to do in that debate, and hopefully that's something that you'll share when you'll share that my conclusion when you see it, the debate as well.
I think that definitely came across, and also that the criticisms that you were raising, in particular about the comprehensive conception of the good and why that's problematic. I felt his reply was not really, it wasn't actually helping his position. It was sort of a defense which was leading to other vulnerabilities being exposed. So I wanted to play a small clip in which he actually speaks about this and then get your reaction of it. Okay, no, that's not the clip. There it is.
So that's one thing I wanted to say. Another thing that I want to say is that the way that liberals will think about this, the set of laws that you devise when you're devising the laws for a liberal state is a minimal set of laws. It's just the laws that you need in order to make it possible for people to pursue their comprehensive conceptions of the good as far as they can, limited by everyone else being able to do it as well. And the laws don't. There aren't lots of additional laws on top of that. Now, when it comes to the question that was just asked, right, about which kind of state provides more freedoms to people, I mean, you can think about it in theoretical terms or you can think about it in historical terms, and it's worth looking at the history here.
Okay, so he's going to go into a different point here, but I thought when you raised the whole issue of, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you were basically saying is you cannot just have a vague notion of the comprehensive good because the state will have to lean towards one particular interpretation. What he was trying to say is, well, if there isn't a convergence, it's a beautiful thing because we have the minimum amount of laws and everyone's, just able to, have their own good conceptions within that state. So could you just elaborate on that? Because I just felt like he didn't, like his response to that point that you made, it was too short to to even see if it was even a response in the first place.
Yeah. So, in essence, during my opening statement, I mentioned that very briefly that liberalism, tries to prevent conflict, but it doesn't have a basis for even saying why conflict is bad in the first place. It doesn't say like what kind of conflict and why is it bad, and what is acceptable levels of conflict, what is not acceptable levels of conflict that might occur in society. Where is it inevitable levels of conflict, and then how do we adjudicate which to which side, right? And just to give you an example, I don't want to keep this too abstract. I want to always give you kind of concrete examples. So everyone has freedom of speech in liberal states, in theory. And I mentioned during the debate the issue of a Christian preacher exercising his freedom of speech to preach that lesbianism was a sin against God and homosexuality is a sin on the public street.
Yeah.
But then what happened was that because his criticism from the Bible, merely expressing his concept of the good, the very mere fact that he expresses it impinges upon people's enjoyment of their own life choices, presumably LGBTQ members of the community members, that his speech has to be limited. He now cannot exercise that freedom because it, even though he wasn't physically attacking anybody, but because it was deemed to be a kind of harassment or giving a type of social compulsion against people freely enjoying their own conception of the good. And that was one small little example I brought up. There's just to highlight that point. Something that liberals really can't address. I actually had a debate once. I think it was in the Midlands, UK. It was a university, and the debate was on limits of religion. And I think how much limits should religion be limited in liberal states? So like what kind of limit should be on religion in a liberal state? And at the end of this debate, one liberal got up and said that I thought that there was possibility for freedom and liberty for everybody, but it's sad to say that I think there has to be some restrictions on liberty for the sake of other people's liberty, unrelated to physical harm. Or even unrelated to physical harm generally. So now the question is, okay, so out of the two, which one do you prefer? And then there's where your values lie. The one that you prefer out of the two, that's where your values lie. That's where you are no longer neutral. So those things I brought up. And of course, when Graham Oppy mentions that that the law should only be necessary to ensure all these conceptions of the good don't clash with each other, that's a highly complicated and almost Sisyphean task. Because you're never going to do that. That's no wonder they legislate laws every single day in most Western countries. There's a new law every single day of their existence. Does that sound like a practical law system for any civilization? So those are the kind of things that I brought up, and that's where Oppy really, I think his strategy was simply just to reiterate the mantra of liberalism, like that would be perhaps sufficient to dispel these contentions. But unfortunately, as you'll probably see in the debate, I made sure that these contentions never were dispelled and kept coming back, seeking an answer.
There's something that he mentioned, and I don't have the timestamp for it, so I'm just going to articulate his point, and then I'm going to play your response. He was talking about people's choices and people's desires, like that being a very powerful reason for why liberal societies are better than Islamic societies. And then you gave a response which was quite interesting. Just going to add it there.
A liberal rubric, and I think just so finally, when we discuss liberal societies, there's many aspects that I do want to raise, which is, for example, that you might have an idea that people can do as they please or do as they want, but this assumes that people's kind of desires are fully autonomous. They come from themselves. No one can influence them. No one can kind of cajole them into any particular activity. But also that the state ideology.
I think there's.
Okay, yeah, you couldn't complete your point because of time and stuff, but I thought it was very important because. Essentially, what he was trying to say is that, there's free choice and people do what they desire. And the point that you were trying to make is actually the strongest can control people's ideas of what they like and what they don't like.
Yeah, well, actually, he just reminded me of the time, but I actually continued after he reminded me of the time, so I actually continued my response. But in essence, it's fine. I mean, in essence, what you said is correct. In kind of explaining my point was there's so much. It's based on the kind of liberal conception of where choices and desires comes from. And it's about that you're the individual. So individuals, I often said that the tawheed of liberalism is individualism. Right? So it believes that humans, in essence, are God, or have the attributes of God, in that we are the ones who can almost like a libertarian free will, even though they're not all libertarians. But it's that our choices, we create them ex nihilo. There's nothing triggering us. There's nothing motivating us. We don't have hunger to satisfy or instincts that are triggered, that we are reacting to, but we are just emanating these choices from ourselves, from nothing. We are truly choosing anything we want to do. This was something that became popular in social idealism. Not all so Enlightenment thinkers we're not libertarians on the most part, but the continental philosophers. So European liberals or left-wing philosophers were coming up with this kind of idea, and it became in vogue. And you know it today as people saying, "I need to live authentically. I live an authentic life, and be myself." That's people. When people say that, they're referring to the social idealist conception of choice and desires. But even before that,
sorry,
yeah.
just if you can explain. What is the social idealist conception of desires?
Okay, so social idealism, in essence, comes from the Western Enlightenment schools of thought that were, you could say, I call them mind first. So they believe that the human mind is almost detached from the body, so to speak. It functions above. It's not controlled by the body or coerced by the body, but it itself is the driver of the body, and it initiates. And it was from this line of thinking that people argued that that gender is a construct, and it's a construct that enslaves the mind, because all our minds are equal. So the social idealists were the ones who argued that the mind has has infinite capacity to create, and it initiates creation. It initiates the creation of its choices and what it wants to do, and once it wants to express itself. So liberty or freedom, or even the good, is letting the mind basically express itself as it sees fit. The mind of every individual do so, and pursue its wants and desires and how it wants to change the world. This actually emanated from the thinking of Hegel, the philosopher Hegel. So that's where social idealism came from, and it's actually in vogue in the West. Utilitarians are those who argue about maximum pleasure for the maximum amount of people. They're usually confined to economists or anything that involves statistics, like health, looking at the health programs and vaccines and things like that. They look at numbers and risks and statistics and so on. So their utilitarians are applied there. Social idealists are usually applied to social policy in the West. So that's just to explain what I meant by social idealism in the West, and how it was one of the main driving forces of the liberalism we live in today, called social liberalism, or liberalism 2.0, as I like to call it. Just to briefly mention something that was you mentioned earlier. I didn't really discuss it, which is when I mentioned about the Enlightenment philosophers who believed that humans were in a state of like as individuals, just roaming around by themselves, doing whatever they want. So this was actually Jacques Rousseau's idea. He actually thought humans were quite literally, before society, individuals running in the wild. A man and woman would meet in the wild, they'd have sex, and then she might get pregnant, and then they would just part their separate ways after that one encounter, and they wouldn't form families at all. And once the woman has given birth and she's reared the child to a mature age, she'll just leave it and for it to fend for itself. This is Jacques Rousseau's quite insane presupposition. John Locke didn't say it quite like that, but he intimated that there must have been individuals before you had society, before you had state. And he just said that he just kind of left it out there that, like, what do you think is more convincing? that the state was there at the beginning, or there was no state and everyone was just individuals before there was political communities and societies and so on and so forth. So he writes like that. And Hobbes basically says he doesn't really care if they actually if it was real or not. But he says that most of the world today, or many parts of the world today, are people who are in essence running around as individual savages. And he, again, as in his typical colonial fashion, cites North America and other such tribes as the Europeans had encountered at that time. So that's where these are the kind of the three thinkers, but they're not the only three that developed this idea of presupposition of humans starting out in nature as individuals, and that's part of our actual intrinsic natures to be individual. And so the point of social society is to allow us to continue to live as individuals without physically harming each other. And that was the assumption that is at the basis of classical liberalism and was preserved in its core DNA into social liberalism.
Yeah, and just as this is a good segue to speak about popular culture. And, this whole Hobbesian idea that at rock bottom, life in the state of nature was short, brutish, and nasty. And, coronavirus for people is basically exposing the veneer that beneath this society and civilization and ethics and morals, we basically are, it's all against all. It's you versus the postman. It's you versus your neighbor. It's every man for himself. And it's interesting because, in very popular films like the recent Joker film, this thing comes across that actually society, once we get past this, once the social contract essentially breaks down, people will go mad. And, deep down, I think some people do actually believe this. But they don't know that obviously liberalism is based upon these types of, complete and utter fairy tales. But people actually believe this stuff.
I mean, the thing is this, Thomas Hobbes, he was one who argued that, in essence, the natural state of man is war against each other. So every human against every other human being. Actually, Oppy was trying to, he mentioned briefly that, but humans value things. You'll tend to see they'll value love, friendship, and family. So in a liberal state, people will form families. They'll have friends. They'll say that it's good to love rather than hate. So we don't need to, in a way, tell people that they have to do those things or encourage those things because it will be done naturally. Or almost he's implying this, that it will be done naturally, that it just happens naturally. And what's interesting is that he failed to consider that while humans and in essence our fitra, our basic nature, might give rise to to desire friendship, love, and family, liberalism allows social forces to be commanded by powerful, influential behaviors and individuals which are touting these behaviors that devastate families, devastate friendships, devastate love, so much so that love is an ideal, but then how to practically realize that ideal? Is it just is to kind of manifest love simply just posting hearts on your Instagram profile or something like that? Paying lip service to it, listening to the love songs, but deep down in relationships, it's about what people can extract from the other person. You have emotional leeches, people that just want to use another person for their own romantic interests, very narcissistic kind of interest. So these things that liberalism just simply can't prevent happening because it has to allow personal freedom for people to go out, and they will then popularize very negative antisocial traits, and also they will undermine the family itself. With like if you can do zina, so let's say if you're a nasty kind of guy and you can do zina with tons and tons of girls, why would you want to even get married in the first place? What's the point of getting married in the first place? And then whether you're a guy or a girl, in fact, even if you did get married, there's always, because of kind of the flouting of sexuality in society, people are constantly reminded of the opportunity cost of committing to one person. Opportunity cost is an economics term. It means that what you lose out by not actually investing your time or money on another product that you could have bought, and which I think is an analogy for a capitalist system, because they view that if they're committed to one partner, they've missed out on quote unquote another product that their individualistic selves can enjoy by going and pursuing other people. So this is the kind of issue that we find in liberal societies that they just can't guard against. They just can't prevent without it going against their very the equations that made them liberal in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So just before we get more into social corruption, because I definitely want to cover that in more detail just after this. But one of the points that you were making was the flip side of this, which is that if I think you called it an artificial state of nature that liberalism allows, in which you can have these, going back to your example of the playground with sand and stuff, someone making a pothole or being involved in some sort of social corruption and other people falling into it. And then the state would have to have some form of intervention which would go against his very principles. One of the things that Oppy responded to, and I didn't really, it wasn't convincing at all, and maybe his argument has more mileage than what maybe I understood, but he was trying to basically say two things at once. In essence, he's trying to say that you can have a comprehensive I'm actually losing track of what exactly he said. I'm just going to play the clip, and then it's going to sort of remind me of what exactly his main argument was.
I wanted to make the point you just made. I'm forgetting already. I'm getting tired. It's getting so late. Right. So yes, the point about the idea that somehow or other, in trying to make room for competing conceptions of the good, you end up committing to a conception of the good. That actually isn't true. That just misrepresents the liberal position, because the idea is that we have competing sort of comprehensive conceptions of the good, and each of us, whether singly or collectively in groups of whatever sizes, entitled to pursue these conceptions consistent with allowing everybody else the same degree of latitude in pursuing them. That's not now a comprehensive conception of the good. It's not a conception about the meaning of life, about what makes life worth living, and so on. It's a framework that enables people to pursue their substantive conceptions of the good without imposing any particular substantive conception upon them. And that's going to be quite different from what you get in a state that's controlled by religious authorities, where there is a particular conception, a conception that says that the good flows from a particular God, and there's a particular set of edicts that have been issued by God, and these can constitute the framework for proper behaviour and so on, where there's no prospect of getting agreement across the world's religions on those particular edicts and so forth. So I think that actually that worry is quite misguided. It's not that liberalism offers you a comprehensive conception of the good. On the contrary, it's designed specifically to enable a pluralism about comprehensive conceptions of the good. And this is a view that applies at the level of the state and the design of the state, right? And what it emerged out of, well, as I said before, in the UK and in Europe, was out of the kinds of conflicts that arose when particular concepts of the good were allowed to sort of track who was the reigning monarch, and the kind of utter chaos that ensued every time you got a change in who was the monarch, from being a Lutheran to being a Calvinist to being a Catholic, and they're having then saying, so my values are now the values of everyone, which led to enormous social dislocation as people tried to flee to find a country where the ruler was consonant with their values and to avoid getting killed by the people who had the competing values and so on.
Okay, so just on this point, now it's coming back to me that he was essentially trying to address your point that a liberal state will have to not be neutral. It will have to stick to one comprehensive or the majority idea in terms of the comprehensive conception of the good. And then you gave the example, I believe, of like France and self-realization and how they try to implement that.
Yeah. So actually, Graham actually then contradicts himself during the debate a bit later on. So he first argues that liberalism doesn't produce a conception of the good. Now, the first basis for its conception of the good is people being harmoniously living in a society, whereas they're not fighting each other. So that's a good thing. It's a good thing they're not fighting each other. So there's always going to be, from the philosophy of looking at just pure ethics, there has to be a starting foundation as to what are we trying to pursue in the first place, which is something which I kind of raised, that there has to be an idea of some good, what to even begin the process of why even implement liberalism in the first place. However, in its more purer form in the 19th century, it led to much worse oppression than I think we've probably seen today, although some argue oppression in a different form. We now have oppression in a different form. So you had people starving to death on the streets of London. You had, this is during the time of Charles Dickens, and much of his literature was kind of talking about that kind of human misery in the capital of the most biggest empire in the world at that time. So and yet there was starvation, there was deprivation, there was no health system. If you were a miner, you were basically disposable. You're a factory worker, you're disposable. If you hurt yourself in the factory, you'd be fired. Too bad. Your only hope was to go to a church charity that would maybe give you some alms, but that's about it, really. No one's going to help you. No one's going to give you medication. You have to pay for it. And so, in a way, the United States of America is kind of still one foot in the previous version of liberalism,
classical liberalism.
Yeah, that's classical liberalism. It failed. The amount of wealth inequality that occurred at that time was worse than today. And as I mentioned, actually, in the debate or discussion rather, such that there was huge deprivation amongst people. It came to the point where people said, it's true that man cannot live without bread, but without bread, man cannot live. Right? This is what the founders of the new kind of liberal movement in the UK said, to kind of hearken in this new social liberalism that was coming in. That now there was misery. Misery means something's going wrong. Right? People are unhappy. People are dying. It tugged at the heartstrings. They knew that it was wrong. How to deal with this? Well, we're now going to have to define a conception of what is good. And Oppy contradicted himself, because later on in the debate, once I kept bringing up all these problems, he said, "Oh, but we have developed new welfare systems. We developed, we evolved liberalism to deal with it. Oh, but welfare based on what understanding of what is good, and what is the circumstances that you deem humans deserve to have, based on what criteria? Because now you have to adopt more and more criteria to define what does children deserve education. That wasn't very obvious for people back then. People thought, look, if you want education, your parents will teach you. The child will apprentice with a craftsman. You're no one's owed an education, and surely your parents will teach you all you need to know. But to have a fully rounded education with being taught mathematics and history and literature, this was something that usually only the middle class could afford. But now we have mass printing techniques and so on and so forth, that it's now cost effective. You can now teach, albeit large class sizes, but you can teach now working class children stuff that only the middle or upper class children would have only had access to, albeit they probably had better private teachers. But anyway, so these things all changed. Everything changed in liberalism because they adopted conceptions of the good. Even France's adoption of its laissez-faire, its current understanding of laissez-faire, was actually just over 100 years ago. It wasn't in the French Revolution, right? People think it was the French Revolution. No, the French Revolution even ultimately failed, and there was a Bourbon Restoration. There was a whole number of things anyway. I won't go into that. So the Oppy countered my he almost then kind of almost sidestepped my critique to say, okay, maybe almost trying to almost concede that you're criticizing classical liberalism, but don't worry, we've evolved a new liberalism. I say, exactly, that's my point. Based on what? Based on identifying or positing what is a conception of the good, upon which now to give people positive rights, as opposed to negative rights. Negative rights is I leave you alone. I don't interfere with your life, or I don't oppress you. I don't physically harm you. Positive right is you deserve something from me. So from the state in this case, and they argue it today. They say women have the positive right to get state-paid abortions, for example. They don't now. It's not a private right. That would be a negative liberty. But there are debate in many American states is, should women's abortions be funded by the state? Right now, these all required then the state to adopt a conception of what is good, what is a duty, what is obliged, what is welfare, and then to start implementing it upon everybody. And of course, as we know in England, the state attempted to discuss what is extremism, and arguably it still is trying to push an agenda that recognizes an official definition of extremism, which we know as to be just the modern day, the secular word for heresy, and they're trying to now judge who is a radical and extremist in our society and who's not a radical and extremist in our society, based purely on the ideas in their head, not on whether it involves violence or advocacy for violence. So these are the kind of things that I raised, and Oppy actually ended up contradicting himself, perhaps unwittingly, to not realizing it to himself. So that was quite fascinating to see during the discussion.
Yep, and there's something else he said which is linked to this. I just want to play that.
One last closing remark.
Very
for
quick,
sure.
Very quick comment. So some of these examples don't involve comprehensive conceptions of the good, right? It's hardly a comprehensive conception of the good that you're just going to snort cocaine for the rest of your life, right? So that example really doesn't count, right? That's not what the kind of Rawlsian framework is aiming to maintain neutrality between. There's a question about paternalism that does come up for liberals, but many people think, so I mean your example is kind of interesting with alcohol, because a country like Australia has used a kind of series of nudges over a long period of time now to drive down tobacco consumption for various reasons, and it seems to good effect. And my prediction is that the future is going to see a similar kind of campaign for alcohol in countries like Australia. There are a series of nudges, so nothing very draconian, but coupled with the kind of British approach of raising the excise steadily, which has happened with tobacco as well. And for reasons having to do with the fact that actually for most people, health is going to be part of their sort of comprehensive view about what the good life of people consists in, and this is just a way of helping them to achieve what they really want. So that's on the alcohol tobacco one. On the religion and child abuse one, I think that actually the approach that takes that line is kind of illiberal, right? It's not respecting the autonomy it's not respecting the comprehensive conceptions of the good of the parents who wish to raise the child in their religion. And I think that it's just a mistake to claim that it's child abuse for parents to want to raise their children in their religion. So I don't think that liberals are going to particularly have a problem with that one either. I guess there's not enough time to continue.
Okay, so here, I'm sure you can say a lot more about this, but I really disagreed with him with the way that he tried to show, this is what liberals as a monolithic group would say. You could almost hear the liberals in the background saying, well, what about the autonomy of the child? What about, so health is important, but pleasure and health, there's a trade-off. There's always a trade-off, because we could literally be eating soybeans all our life, right? And we'd probably live longer, and we'd probably be healthier than if we were to eat junk food and the sort of things that we love. And so I found that he was always trying to make it look like liberals have got it together. We generally see this as illiberal. We generally see that these issues are not really the comprehensive conception of the good. But it just wasn't even convincing. I didn't even need to wait for your reply, but it just didn't look strong at all.
Yes, I think his whole argument demonstrably faltered to the audience on the alcohol and cocaine example I gave, because classical liberalism wouldn't have a problem with cocaine and alcohol. Social liberalism does have a problem with cocaine. Why? Because I think many Muslims have often wondered, why are drugs banned? Why are they prohibited? If you're free to do whatever you want, as long as you don't physically harm people. John Stuart Mill made an argument. He said that alcohol should only be banned for people who, when they've gotten drunk, they have demonstrably done something bad while being drunk, as in they've done a crime, an actual crime. But it should be allowed for everybody until they do their first crime, at least provable crime, anyway. So in essence, the idea came about, the argument that was developed by social idealists, British social idealists, and then it spread to the United States, although in the United States it got repackaged as the Christian temperance movement. So they thought it would be unseemly for a Christian to drink alcohol, full stop, the devil's drink, they would say. And they argued, the social idealists argued, that drugs enslaves the mind. It makes you a slave to addiction to a substance. You're not making a free choice when you're enslaved, and you can't consent to self-enslavement, they said. Therefore, drugs must be banned which enslave you. And they tried in America to ban alcohol. They actually implemented a ban, called the Prohibition era. It didn't work out so well. Ask Al Capone. But also, they were thinking about doing it in Britain, but there was a much more of a pushback because, as you know, British people work hard, play harder. So they were not going to accept an alcohol ban so much. They implemented half measures, things like prohibiting being drunk in public, which is still a law in UK. It's very, you could say, Sharia law. You could say it's actually illegal to be drunk in public in England, but it's just not applied. I know a little joke about this. I spoke to a police officer about this once, and I said, "Why don't you prosecute people who are drunk in public? Because it's in the law books. It's active English law." And he said, "Well, if I did that, I'd have to arrest myself first because I've been drunk." So this is then the inconsistency in against what Oppy is saying, because clearly they developed the idea that it goes against the self-actualization of the individual to enslave themselves. Now, we know from discussing with utilitarians who are not social idealists, but Bentham anyway, that his arguments, people noted that his arguments could be used to argue that if someone takes drugs and experiences euphoria, that he's maximized his own pleasure at that time, and they would have no argument against it, as long as he could do it in a way whereby he doesn't become a junkie, as they say, and living in an alleyway and destitute. So if he can manage his addiction and enjoy it to a moderate level, why not? Why not take drugs? In fact, drugs might even be recommendable because it maximizes pleasure. It should be of the society. And John Stuart Mill tried to rescue utilitarianism from to make it liberal compliant, so that it couldn't be used to argue again for despotism or totalitarianism. Anyway, so Oppy kind of failed on this matter, and you're absolutely right when he argued that that parents should have the right to decide how their child is educated and what religion they're told to believe in. He was making an argument that many other liberals, I mean, I could just, they could debate Dr. Oppy very effectively, saying that what about, as you put it, the right of the child to be as an autonomous individual, being impinged in their potential future choices by being indoctrinated with the presuppositions and dogmas and doctrines of religion. Of course, they don't consider liberalism or anything of Western culture to be an equal indoctrination and presupposition. Only spiritualist religions or non-materialist conceptions. So You're absolutely right. These are contradictions in their own worldview. So they do bring in ideas of what is welfare. And it's just ridiculous, because how is the government going to decide what is good for the society? How is the government going to decide? Did you know that John Locke argued that people should be given the maximum amount of freedom, limited by the public interest? Which, again, massive question mark. What is the public interest? How do you define it? What is welfare? How do you define welfare?
And I think just on this point, this brings up, I think, a brilliant argument that you raised, which he didn't address at all. And that was to do with objectification of women as a social corruption, and that leading to zina, that leading to unhappy marriages because of opportunity cost, like you rightfully mentioned. And this really got me thinking, because if we take that point that you just raised, which is we give people the maximum amount of freedom, until it conflicts with the public interest. Now, when I was thinking about this, it's just something playing on my mind. If we look at generally in society, and according to, say, a particular conception of what is good looking according to current celebrity culture, whatever, and we were to go out in society and round up the men and the women, and we were to do a sort of tally, we would see, okay, so 20% maybe fit into the really good looking category, 80% below average, according to that arbitrary standard which is currently prevailing. And then because of constant objectification of women in particular, and this is not only in the sex industry but porn industry, or just generally advertising and these types of things, that if collectively there was a public interest in which people wanted stable marriages and they wanted these problems not to exist, then in a way you could potentially argue that in a liberal society, if that was the national interest, then the objectification of women could be criminalized. It could actually be a crime, which in a way is what Islam teaches, because in Islam, and I don't think it's a stretch to say, objectification of women is actually a crime against the public interest and is state enforced.
Indeed, that's a very interesting kind of point I've raised in the past, which is I think I did some lectures on advocating the Sharia and criticizing liberalism at a few universities, and one of the things I pointed out was, in essence, Islam wants to encourage and channel the human reproductive instinct and its urges to the people's spouses. So a husband to be really attracted to his wife, a wife to be really attracted to the husband. So both the husband and the wife have to look their best, have to try to look nice and be physically fit, and not wear shabby clothes in their house and all these kind of things. But also to prevent people from being bombarded with opportunity costs from the wider society. So the man and women are not going to be looking at people's abs or the women's some short skirts and low cut tops in society. That stuff won't be there, emphasizing the sexual attributes of the genders. And one of the things that I thought about even before I became Muslim was I often wondered what was the point of the woman's hijab in the film. Like, why is Islam having the woman's hijab for? If Islam was invented by a man, you could say it would want women to be as exposed as possible, because
that's a brilliant point. That's a brilliant point.
So, because in essence, if you were to take, I don't know, let's say a 14th century European, bring him to this time, and tell him everything that all the changes that have been made, and he'd tell you, say, like, let me get this straight. You're telling me that we no longer have to actually kind of pay money for women in a marriage and look after them and do all these particular things, but as long as we can charm any woman we want, we can actually sleep with them for free, in essence, and they will pay half the bills if we ever live together in a house and work. So I don't even have to pay anything or give any kind of commitment. And even you don't even have to even commit. You can just be a Lothario in society, as long as you have the charm for it. You can get as many women, like these, they're called, is it pickup artists, I believe. They
Yeah.
They and ironically, feminists say that they accuse them of being misogynists, hating women. These pickup artists who are merely advocates for liberating male sexuality in an individualistic worldview context, and they're like, okay, we're males and we can pick up women, so pick up as many women as possible, all consensual, and you can play with their hearts and play with their with their expectations and say all kinds of things to land them in the bed, and then you can go about and find another woman, because there's plenty of variety out there, and as the saying goes in the West, variety is a spice of life. And of course, the idea to just much like the hadiths that talk about the son of Adam will not be happy if with 2 valleys filled with gold they want a third one. So son of Adam likewise would never be happy with one woman when they can get other women and new women to quote unquote spice up their life from their almost hedonistic perspective, a hedonist perspective that is not prevented in a liberal society from flourishing and spreading around society. So these are all these issues, and I think one of the many issues I wanted to raise is that many people in the West are just are miserable because of the chaos of the relationship system, the system of how the chaotic system of forming relationships, courtships. At least in Islam, it's structured. When you do have a rishta, as the Urdu saying goes, right? You go to a person's family, you get to know the woman, everyone knows what you're there for. You're there for marriage. You speak to the family, you meet the woman. Arabic societies too, maybe some Turkish, Muslim societies, they practice this. It's very defined, and it's actually also overlooked by the wali, the guardian of the woman. So you kind of filter out those lotharios, those time wasters, so to speak. But in the West, it's a completely chaotic system, and women experience this the other side of that, not just meeting guys who are not wanting commitment, but meeting guys who they don't want to be to speak to, but because in the West it's about you should make an approach if you like someone, as long as you don't physically attack them. Women are harassed every day in society by guys who there is no system of courtship in the West. So in essence, it's if you can get a woman, then you can get a woman, but if you can't, what have you, but you still have to approach them in public potentially. And women are every day harassed by men who want them for a relationship or sexual activity, and they're not interested in these men, and they feel that it's very difficult for them to go out. It's stressful to go out because of all these individuals. But at the same time, if they don't go out and maybe in a presentable form, they'll never land Mr. Right. They'll never find that Mr. Right guy they'd like to harass them and approach them, so to speak. So this is the kind of chaos in the Western system that leads to so much misery. And this is one of the issues, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. But I raised again in the Oppy debate, discussion, Oppy raised the inconsistencies of how liberalism fails to protect the family from adultery and things like that, which Islam does. And at the same time, it's inconsistent on alcohol and cocaine, and shows to Oppy that in essence, it contradicts his very claims that liberalism is completely neutral and doesn't say anything about any of the competing conceptions of the good. So I think that was very good that was raised in the discussion. And I think Oppy perhaps hadn't considered those examples, and maybe hopefully it's food for thought for him going forward, perhaps for his future discussions on liberalism.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things which he did try and respond to, as we saw in the clip earlier, was when he tried to speak about cocaine and alcohol and how you can have these nudges, but at the same time, he was concerned about the illiberal implementation of parents not being allowed to raise their children. So there's this constant struggle between, okay, but this thing is bad in society, but then people have free choices and we shouldn't intervene. And then when it came to these particular points that you raised, especially about marriage, because marriage, is the smallest unit, and then you get the family, then you get the street, then you get the town, then you get the country, and you get civilization. And at this base point, what I found just dead silence on from him was he literally did not say anything about this. And that was a little bit disappointing, because he kept going back to historical examples. So he went back to the historical example of why in liberalism the having one comprehensive conception of the good was not a good idea, and he also went into the Ottoman history, and then he went to an example in Nigeria. But when it comes to something very clear and concrete that I think you mentioned a few times, right, there was just silence. And I think this is one of the strongest points that we have as Muslims, we don't use enough. Now, Abdullah, I remember watching your videos back in Speaker's Corner, the early 2000s, right? So those old videos where you used to have the turban and stuff. There used to be this communist speaker who used to get up and talk, and he no longer comes, but he was coming around the time that you were there, and he's been missing for a few years now. But in a speech, he said something, right?
Yeah, so he crossed me. That's what happens.
So basically, he said, look, he was very anti-religious, by the way, as communists are, right? As socialists and these types of people are. And he said, look, whatever you say about the Muslims, whatever you say, we cannot knock the fact that they have the family unit together. The man has a role, the woman has the role, and the children are raised up. And even though I've seen him in the park criticizing Islam, criticizing Christianity, criticizing religion in particular, this was a point in which he was praising the Muslims. And that got me thinking that this is such a strong point, and we should use this against liberalism, because there are so many women out there who fell for this nonsense about, focus on your career, and you can go for Mr. Right in your 30s, and this pickup artist culture that you spoke about, in which men are just hedonistically looking for just the body count, as they say, right, just sleeping with as many women as possible. And there's a lot, Abdullah, there is a lot of trauma in society. There's a lot of unhappiness in society.
Yes, indeed. It's just something that people often tend to forget. Now, I was also going to talk about the issue of the economic system of liberalism as well, causing mass misery. Oppy mentioned that social liberalism did implement welfare systems for the poor to address the fact that there was monopolies going on, and these massive corporations taking the majority of wealth, and it wasn't trickling down to everybody as classical liberalism had hoped or had a blind faith that it would. However, even with welfare systems, if there's not enough money in the coffers of the state to actually pay the people, then the people still there'll be not enough money to give them as their welfare checks. And I wanted to actually discuss more about the economic system. I've done a lecture. About it. But Dr. Oppy said in the pre-debate discussion or pre-discussion discussion that he didn't really want to discuss, or he didn't want to defend the liberal idea of freedom of ownership. That's not something that he agreed with. This was actually in our kind of pre-discussion discussion where we were talking about, in essence, the questions that the moderator will discuss and how the discussion will be roughly structured. And I actually told him some of the basic ideas of liberalism that we can go through, freedom of speech. We actually were going to go through that. There wasn't enough time. I was wanting to go through that. Freedom of speech, freedom of personal freedom, freedom of ownership. And he said, I recall that he didn't necessarily agree with the freedom of ownership concept. But I said, well, that's a really basic part of liberalism. And I made a point during the discussion to remind him in public that, as the joke goes, possession is 9/10 of the law. The law, 9/10 of our law system, is to do with ownership and how you execute your wealth and all this kind of stuff, how you spend it. So anyway, there was that. Now, someone mentioned. I just saw someone mention in the comments. They said, "Isn't there a lot of sexual harassment in Egypt currently, and it's rising?" Yes, that's exactly true. There is. But notice where and when this arises, right? During the revolution, the so-called revolution against Mubarak, we see sexual harassment kind of rise in the Tahrir Square, where all the secular people were kind of attending, and even against the anti-Morsi demonstrations, where again the secular people were attending. But in the Muslim kind of Brotherhood areas, Rabi al-Adawiyya and all these areas where journalists were going through, women were going through, no sexual harassment, none reported in the kind of Muslim areas. And so Egypt is a product of colonialism, by the way. And Egyptians, you can be divided into those who are very, very highly secular influenced and those who are not so much secular influenced. And the more secular influenced areas in society you go, in terms of like in the common areas, you'll find a correlation of sexual harassment there. I think you'll find because Egypt is a colonial construct with and the government was reformed on a secular basis by the colonial powers. That's a minor point to mention, but there's something I wanted us to discuss. Hopefully, with Oppy's opening kind of criticism against Islam. He made 3 points, and I feel perhaps some people wanted some elaboration on that. Do you have those clips just when he discusses Islamic law?
I think I do, but just one thing I wanted you to also speak about, but maybe we should address the questions that people had, because there is something that you raised about equality and the different conceptions of equality leading to warfare amongst liberal states in Europe. And, we normally get this idea of religion being a cause of war and, instability and conflict. Yet just on the idea of equality and, people's liberals' different conception of it, that leading to this bloodbath. I mean, that's an important point, but I think we should address if obviously people have asked questions. So let me go back and try and find that where he critiqued Islamic law. I have your reply, by the way, in which you spoke about the Medina model.
I mean,
maybe if you could summarize what he said,
sure,
and respond to it. Yeah,
it's fine. So I'll summarize kind of Dr. Oppy's kind of opening presentation, but as I said, everybody, please refer to the debate video itself to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting him, because this is meant to be a debate review, and that we need to very carefully represent our interlocutors. So he basically made three main arguments. So the first argument was that there are conflicting understandings of Islamic law. He was trying to, in essence, he was implying this by arguing which understanding are you following, right? Is it the law of the jurists, of the mujtahideen throughout 13 to 1400 years? Is it the law applied by the wala and the shurta, the governors and the police?
Sorry, Abdullah. I've found the clip because I was trying to remember what it was titled, so we can play it instead of you, if you want, regurgitating what he said.
Sure. Could you do it at 1.5 speed?
Sure.
Pursue whatever their religion is, just so long as they're happy to allow other people to pursue their particular comprehensive conceptions. So that's a beginning account about what liberalism is. On the question about Islamic law, so when we were told that we were going to talk about this, I interpreted the expression Islamic law in a kind of narrower way, all the kinds of laws that are going to govern society. And I thought that I would like to hear from you a bit more about exactly what you imagine the content of Islamic law is, because there's several different things that you might mean by it if you think about Islamic tradition. You might mean something like the law that was given by the jurists. You might mean something like the law of the guardians of public order, what the governors and the police actually enacted. Or you might mean something like law that's much more directly grounded in the Hadith, as, for example, Wahhabists and Salafists came to think later in the 18th and 19th century. And these are different and conflicting understandings of what Islamic law is. So maybe we can start. I mean, I'm prepared to say quite a bit more about this. Maybe if you want me to talk a bit longer, I can talk a bit more about my understanding of the law of the jurist.
Yeah, I think that's enough for us to respond to his point. You're muted, by the way.
Yeah, sorry, I just didn't want any reverb from the
Sure.
This one. So that was his first argument. He tried to say there were three different understandings of law, and I basically countered that he then said, so there are three different understandings of law, how it's applied. I said there's only one model when we look at the political rulings, the most perfect of models, and of course the basis for all modeling of Islamic politics and rule, which is the state of Medina, the Medinan model, led by the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his capacity as ruler. And of course, then we afterwards look towards the Sahaba, his Sahaba, Salihin, who continued that model and implemented it with discussions amongst themselves about how best to implement it based on their understanding of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's teachings and so on. And of course, they had knowledge from him from the time of Bayt Arqam, when they were being taught by the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam all the way in Makkah. So we have this as our model template for rulership. And generally speaking, because it was public and politically done by the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there's not really disagreement amongst Muslims about what about these kind of his campaigns, the rules he implemented, the laws he implemented, the punishments that he implemented, and so on and so forth. By and large, I mean, I think the only disagreement I've ever heard of, which was of any kind of significance, was that the Khawarij, of all people, thought that Rajam for stoning was not required because they didn't maybe accept the hadith narrations on it. They didn't think it comes from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But apart from the Khawarij of all people, who didn't think Rajam for stoning, so Rajam for adultery was obligatory, all the schools of thought, Sunni, Shia, the current day Ibadis, which are, you could say, are cousins, ideological cousins of Khawarij, everyone, there's virtual ijma upon them, upon the narrations, upon it. It was a well-tested, it was practiced. This was the thing that he was contesting. Dr. Oppy was saying that the law is not applicable. These laws are not applicable because the evidential requirement is so high. That was his second argument. The evidential requirement is so high that it can't be applied, and he gave a modern day case example. So I basically said, I responded, albeit quite briefly, because I felt like it was not really a serious issue at all, which is, we have the Medina model. Muslims agree on this. The only disputes, the major disputes amongst Muslims regarding the Khilafah, which is the political continuation of its rulership, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is only who should be the Khalif. That's it. Right? Pretty much the basic structure and the rules and laws are pretty much, the basic skeleton structure is the same. No one really disagrees on these things, even between the Shia schools and the Sunni schools, as well as the other schools like the Dhahiriyya and others. So
yeah, I did. He did mention something which he thought it was a point in his favor, when you actually pointed out it was a point against him, in which he quoted a scholar who said that this hudud punishment has basically never virtually been applied. I'm guessing the scholar meant after the passing away of the Prophet ﷺ, because of the evidentiary level being so high. And you sort of, I remember, responded, well, that's the point. The point is that it doesn't go for you to say that these laws are because the evidence is so high, it's not been applied for centuries and centuries. That is the exact point. But also something else which I think is good for you to infuse into this discussion, which is, whereas he's trying to say there's different interpretations from these different levels, or the way that he conceives it, you went back to the Medina model and you said, look, we have a book and we have these things. But when it came to you raising the points in terms of the various interpretations about liberal intervention with limiting toxic ideas like objectification or drugs or these things, or wealth inequality, or any of these social ills, and the varying competing ideas of the good, and the liberal states having these conflicts and wars and all these interpretations, and there being no holy book, he didn't actually have a response. And I felt it was a bad discussion tactic for him to bring up
disputes amongst the Muslims, when on the other side you literally have a free for all, right? From his yeah.
Oh, well, we're definitely going to get into that. I've got some interesting quotations maybe that we could all benefit from, especially because I actually mentioned John Stuart Mill, and he disagreed. He was actually shaking his head on camera when I mentioned that liberal theorists like John Stuart Mill supported colonialism or justified it, and he was like, no, that's not the case. And I was like, that's very odd that he's now disagreeing with me, and he voiced that. He said he voiced that disagreement.
By the way, I have that clip. Shall I play it?
Okay, yeah, but let's go ahead. Let's deal with that at least first, and then actually, do you know what? Just wait 1 second. I want to just finish the Islamic law bit, then that, because that's gonna be a bit more spicy, I suppose. So let's save it. So okay, so in the discussion, I mentioned to him. So he made this argument that there's difference of opinion on different laws, and I said, like, look, all the laws come from the Quran and Sunnah. Everyone has to refer back to the Quran and Sunnah. Whether they're the jurists, the governors, or whomever, everyone has to go back to that text, not just the quote unquote Salafists, right? We all have to go back to the Quran and Sunnah as our basis. It's just so he said that. I decided not to comment on or he said, sorry, Wahhabists or whatever. I think he used that word instead. So then he tried to say that jurists tried to revise the laws and make the evidentiary requirement high because they felt the laws were unconscionable, implying that the jurists felt that the laws were in essence immoral or bloodthirsty or something like, or cruel, the laws which are from Revelation, right? Which is ridiculous. And then my rebuttal to him in the debate was that no, the high evidentiary requirement and the requirement to find any excuse to let off people who've been accused of breaking hudud laws is from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself, not from these later jurists thinking, our religious tradition is so harsh. No, it wasn't them saying this. It wasn't them actually thinking that at all whatsoever. The idea of being merciful, and when someone has done something maybe in private and it somehow comes out in public, we should find some way to negate it and actually deny it, that it actually is even occurring. And then this led me to my argument, which is the laws are designed primarily to be a deterrent, so that people don't go out in public and do it openly and don't normalize it. Okay, if you have such a law, even though it can't be applied in most cases, it's not, the purpose is not to punish everyone who does it. It's to protect society by making it so reprehensible. This is how the punishment has to be, because it's so reprehensible, but it's not to apply it because, and hence the evidentiary level is quite high. And he quoted the historian Marion Holmes Katz, who said that it was never applied on evidence alone, as in it was applied based on people volunteering a confession, but never on evidence alone. The reason that some people might do it by confession is because, as we know in Islam, if you get punished in this life, you don't get punished in the next life for that particular sin. You guarantee that your sins are forgiven on that thing if you get punished for that crime in this life. So many Muslims felt so guilty they would go out and they'd want to try to confess. And even then we have Sunnah indicating from the Rasulullah sallallahu that he disapproved of people even seeking or confessing to seek the punishment. Right? He asked one individual who's Hazal, who had confessed to the crime of zina, and Hazal said, "Why had he done it?" He said his companion advised him to confess, go out and be punished for it, and he was advised, according to this narration, so that if only your companion had put his cloak over you, or to paraphrase, or just told you to keep it secret, right? And then ask Allah for, basically ask Allah for forgiveness instead, rather than just going out and seeking the public punishment for it, right? So that's quite interesting. Most people don't realize this. So this is not some later jurist saying this stuff. This is actually the mercy from the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But then Dr. Oppy said something, and I don't, and it got maybe lost in the discussion. And it's something I have responded to before in many of my lectures and debates on this topic in the past. And it got, I would have, when I was after the event, I thought, and I was looking back at it, I thought, I should have, there's something I should have said that I've said before. So he said, what's the point of having a law that is not applied because it won't have any deterrent effect. Who's going to be worried or scared of a law that can never be applied because the evidentiary level is so high? So I would have simply said, okay, well, what's the point of the laws against rape in the United Kingdom when the conviction rate is according to some statistics 3 to 2%? It's really low conviction rate, because generally it's a literal he said versus she said issue, where the only evidence is someone making the accusation in most cases, and the man saying, well, no, it was consensual. So then who's to say if it was not a situation of buyer's remorse, as it's called, whereby someone had sex with someone, then regretted it later and accused them of rape because they felt they were emotionally manipulated, even though they were manipulated into consensually agreeing to sex. So, but here's the thing, though. In the West, even though most people are not convicted for rape who have been accused of rape, it's extremely scary to be accused of rape in the first place, right? It's just, you don't know what could happen if you're on that roller coaster. There were some footballers who were falsely accused of rape. They were exonerated by actually cast iron evidence with video footage and showing that actually they didn't do anything of the like. But they said their life felt destroyed just by the very accusation of rape, even though they actually weren't prosecuted, and they were fully exonerated by compelling evidence showing that they actually didn't do that. Yeah. Likewise, imagine someone committing adultery, and then the accusation is raised, and the being arrested, and the whole court process, and in fear that even though it's unlikely, but you could be punished for this, and the punishment is very high. And so I use this analogy in my past discussions on this issue, which I said, imagine there's a law that said that anyone consorting or associating with a unicorn should be very slowly hung, drawn, and quartered. Okay, it's like crazy. Like that's really, it's really, a horrific way to die. You think, yeah, but unicorns don't exist. But you'd think twice before drawing a unicorn, just drawing a picture of a unicorn, right? You think, will I be suspected of consorting with a unicorn, or is this associated? You'd be so scared to even approach it, right? But even though they don't exist, right? But you might think, does it apply to images? And would I be accused of something? Like this is the kind of situation, the deterrent effect, and why the punishment is so is actually quite severe. And the evidentiary requirement is commensurate to its severity. It's not for application, but it has to be severe because it has to have that deterrent effect. And it almost also gives a physical analogy for Muslims as to just how severe this sin is, how significant the sin is, such that if you were to be forgiven of it in this life, automatically you'd have to go through this kind of punishment for it, right? So all this is a comprehensive psychological and social means that Islam uses, the wisdom it uses to actually achieve the desired effect of protecting the social mindset from the normalization of things that undermine the institution of marriage, which adultery and zina do, fornication and so on.
Yeah, and the way that this point was initially raised was he was speaking about the in essence he was speaking about, okay, so which Islamic law, right? And then he went into obviously the sort of impractical, what he thought impractical nature of these types of laws. However, then later on, when the discussion moved on to colonization, his defense, to your point, was a defense that he was trying to deny you in terms of when he was raising the issue about Islamic law, because what you were referring to is there's a difference between theory and practice, that the Ottomans may have done this or that, but in essence we have a theoretical idea, and not theoretical idea, we have a base, and that base is not going to be challenged by what people did later on. But obviously he thought that he almost you can say it was almost like a precedent. So if a caliphate like the Ottomans did something, then it's almost like that is a precedent for Islamic law. But yet, when you raise the whole issue of colonization, he thought what liberal theorists were saying does not impact liberal theory itself. So let's just get into that particular clip, because I thought it was very interesting. And just for the audience, this is after Abdullah raised that, I believe he quoted John Stuart Mill and some others about how liberalism can actually, if you raise your point and then I play his response and then we get into it.
I'll tell you what, just before you do so, just very briefly, I think just to kind of put to bed the whole Islamic law contentions he had. So some Muslims thought, well, how do we resolve difference of opinion in Islam when it comes to politics? Because there are some variations. The minor variations, more or less, but generally speaking, in the branches of jurisprudence, there's always variations and differences. And well, that's why we have government, right? What is the point of government? So the government its purpose is to do tabanni, adoption of a particular opinion against others, and implements that particular opinion on the people, on the Muslims. Muslims don't have to forgo their difference of opinion. They can still say, I disagree with the Caliph on the matter, or I disagree with the judges, the council of judges that the Caliph consulted, or whatever. I disagree with the legislators. I think that this opinion is the strongest in Islam. And that's valid. Muslims have actually learnt, by and large, to live with that difference of opinion now, such that if Muslims wouldn't say the Caliph is invalid because he's a Hanafi and I'm a Shafi.
Yeah,
no one's going to say that. The law is invalid because it's following Imam Malik's fiqh and not Ahmad bin Hanbal's fiqh. No Muslim would say that. The Caliph is valid upon the bay'ah being given, and the point of obedience is to accept the Caliph's adoption on matters of fiqh in your social interactions where it's legal, considering the law, even if you disagree because you feel that the law is not, you have a stronger opinion. And why is that? Because we have this hadith from the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, although we have other texts and from the Quran and Sunnah, but I'm going to bring this one text, which is if a judge in a way does jurisprudential exegesis that really tries to interpret the meaning of the Quran and Sunnah to solve a case, and they get it wrong, they get one reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So God gives them a reward still, even though they got it wrong. Whereas if they exercise their jurisprudential thinking and to do exegesis as sincere as they possibly can, but in this case they get it right, Allah gives them two rewards. The reward is doubled for them. What this means is that the mistaken interpretation, I mean, according to early Christianity or kind of Catholic doctrines, mistaken interpretation is falsehood. And how can you tolerate falsehood? That's why they had their intolerances and wars of religion and fighting in the West. For us, God rewards you for, in essence, doing something that was mistaken, is not true, but a mistaken interpretation. But because you did it sincerely and because you tried your best to interpret the texts and find the strongest opinion, you are still rewarded by God for that. Right? Yeah. So amongst Muslims, it's not about, well, you disagree with me, then you're not a Muslim, or I'm not going to obey this Caliph. None of that. It was the case of, you disagree with me, khair, inshallah, let me try to persuade you. And if you are the Caliph, I will still obey you, even if you don't change your mind to adopt my one, as long as you don't go against the most obvious clear-cut prohibitions in the Quran. So if the Caliph says tomorrow you should worship two gods, not that the Caliph can tell us how we do salah, or how we pray, but let's say the Caliph says everyone is allowed to commit zina, the Caliph becomes invalidated, no longer Muslim, not even can't be your ruler even, if they go against clear-cut, no difference of opinion kind of issues in the core texts of Quran and Sunnah. So that, I think, puts to rest the whole Islamic law discussion that he raised. But let's go to the thing you wanted to raise regarding practice versus theory, because I think now we're now in the right place to engage Graham Oppy's, you could say, double standards when it approaches versus his attempted critique of Islamic law, which I don't think he made successfully, although maybe I felt that Islamic law could always be better elaborated to non-Muslims, but he failed to accept the the more pertinent and more apt criticism of liberalism when there is no holy book of liberalism. Which holy book of liberalism are you going to refer to say this is not liberalism?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And just before we play a related point, I just wanted to wrap up this discussion about the lack of a holy book. So when you have disputes amongst the liberal states, like we did in Europe, about ideas of equality, which can lead to warfare, you don't have something above the liberal states, some text or some ideal above their interpretations that can actually resolve those issues. And within Islamic empires and Islamic countries and, Islamic societies, subhanallah, the Quran even has not, I wouldn't say a law, but it has a paradigm on how to solve a civil war dispute. It's about, okay, so we, you have the arbiter and they try and resolve it. And then you look at which one is the transgressor. So there's something beyond the state. So we have this, in a way, liberalism lacks that international relations perspective when it comes to conflicts with states which also hold on to liberal ideas, when Islam doesn't. Islam does actually have a solving mechanism for that. And I think that was also something that maybe this should be raised to liberals as well. So I'm going to play the clip now. And this is after Abdullah makes the point about liberalism being used to justify colonialism. And I felt this was something that, he didn't respond to well, but let's just hear him out.
Discussion. One thing is, I think that there are a few things to keep separate in the discussion. One thing is about the distinction about the state, what you think about the behaviour of states. Liberalism was focused about what happens in the state. It wasn't about the relationship between states. And there are kind of very obvious differences here. Because within a state, you've got a government, obviously, it's subject to government. The nation is not subject to any kind of ruler. You couldn't be thinking, as you very quickly said, that liberal theory was used to justify colonialism. That's not true. So that's one thing I want to say. Another thing that I want to say is that the way that liberals will think about this, the set of laws that you devise.
Okay, that's a different point that he goes on to. But just before you respond to what he said here, I immediately thought of the League of Nations, right? I mean, what, or even these other organizations which are supposed to be above the states, they are there to apply those liberal ideas, and you do have interventionism. And I was even thinking about new atheism and Christopher Hitchens and this whole idea of exporting democracy, exporting these liberal ideas. It was just a very weak response, I felt, this type of distinction between liberal theorists and liberal theory.
Sure. So this is something I was kind of disappointed about in Dr. Oppy, and he basically challenged me on a point of fact, not really a point of subjective disagreement, where I said that liberal theorists have justified colonialism, and by colonialism I mean the control of other peoples by foreign peoples for the purposes of quote unquote civilizing them, to make them adopt the ideology and way of life or way of managing their affairs of the controlling or conquering group. So he thought that this was, no liberal would ever justify this, even though we have people referring to liberal values today, talking about spreading democracy and getting rid of dictators. That's its current incarnation. And true, many liberals have made arguments against colonialism. But what are their arguments? For those liberals that have made an argument against it, they say that's because it won't be successful in militarily imposing liberalism on other people or changing them. It just won't be successful. Like, if it was successful, great. If not successful, then no point doing it. Not that it was immoral by liberal standards, just that it just wouldn't work. So they are basically skeptics in the practical efficacy of colonialism. That's all. But they're not the only liberals, and there are more mainstream ones, much more seminal ones, such as John Stuart Mill, a key figure in the transition between classical liberalism and social liberalism. So many of his ideas presaged social liberalism, and in fact went on to become social liberalism, or at least a utilitarian basis for many of the things that we understand as social liberalism. I cited Dr. Oppy had said he disagreed. He said what I was saying was incorrect or wrong, that liberal theorists had advocated colonialism. So I basically pointed to the fact that not only had they done so, but they had done so in books which are taken as seminal books of liberal theory, right? So you can't say it's. I'm trying to find an example, but like it's the equivalence of saying that let's say Imam Shafi in his book of fiqh said something, but it's not related to his fiqh. But he wrote whole chapters on something, but don't worry, that's an opinion not related to his thinking, even though in these chapters he shows you from Hadith and Quran how he thinks a particular thing is. You'd say that's a ridiculous argument to make. So John Stuart Mill, in his book,
sorry to cut you off. I thought let's play your response and then you can elaborate on that.
Sure.
Well, let's go through it in the same order you mentioned. I would say you said that liberal theory was never used to justify colonialism because states in their international relations were not subject or beholden to laws, whereas domestically they're beholden to their own laws. I think I would disagree. John Stuart Mill, he wrote many tracts about how colonialism can be justified and why it's a good thing. And he talked about what can motivate and what should be the policy of liberal states concerning foreign relations with quote-unquote barbaric nations. And it didn't require the barbaric nations attack first, but rather that eventually they will have to be subdued and they will have to be controlled with an iron fist until they are able to be improved by intellectual discussion, i.e. He viewed it as if they adopt liberalism, then they can be independent and autonomous, and they've reached maturity. Now, the thing is this, that when any state goes to war, the state has to explain to its people why it's going to war. It can't just say, hey, we're going for money, we're going for wealth or fame. The people just wouldn't accept, especially in representative systems whereby political parties want to get re-elected. So they make excuses like, or that they have to give some justification that the people will accept at the very least, whether it be civilizing the natives. We're doing it for their own good, we're educating them for their own good. We have to go over there and give them superior enlightened values. The domestic policies in these colonial states were justified and even explained based on liberal models of liberal missions to states which are viewed as not liberal, which is they are in states of backwardness. When they went to India, for example, made these arguments about changing the education system, or to better to give Western books and Western philosophy in order for the natives to basically be educated, because their own books are basically or their own rude lights, quote unquote, i.e. their own books are insufficient to give them some kind of enlightenment. This is also Lord Cromer was saying this in Egypt. So liberal theory has been used to justify colonialism, very much so. Tocqueville discusses this as well as many others. Today, we know this as liberal interventionism of a different kind. So it'll be spreading democracy, might be what they will say today. Not just weapons of mass destruction, trying to locate them, but spreading democracy for its own sake is also a key argument. Or spreading freedom was also used to justify the war in Afghanistan, which is now obviously completely failed from the Western perspective of trying to change and impose a foreign system upon the people. So I would very much disagree that liberal theory has not been used to justify colonialism. Indeed, it was centrally located in justifying colonialism because the people wouldn't accept any other reason why you're going around the world and sending British troops to die for what purpose. You mentioned about how Christians and Jews.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a few things we can tease out here. I think you already you mentioned the point about like, for example, Imam Malik and his school of thought and his ideas are they not relevant to his actual school? But I think something which is important is first to give a backdrop to why a liberal would push back against this idea of linking liberalism to colonization. And perhaps it's to do with, because today liberals would be speaking about human rights, about freedom, about democracy, about human self-realization, actualization, whatever you want to call it. And this is something which doesn't fit too well with that narrative. Linking liberalism to the British Empire, something I thought about. Actually, no, I'm going to hold on to that point because there's something today that France is doing, which you can't challenge that thing that they're doing in Africa using liberalism. You'll have to use something else. But anyway, maybe if you can just extrapolate some of these points.
Sure. So so basically, so liberalism has many self-contradictory kind of ramifications of its creed. So its creed, when applied in its branches, will end up contradicting itself. And one example is, so it believes in the non-interference with people who are sovereign of themselves. So every individual is a sovereign to themselves, and so there's nothing more absolute than the individual. And the states that they create are then have a kind of delegated sovereignty by the constituent members who are all individually sovereign. So that was the idea. Okay, fine. But then what about a state that doesn't implement or care about sovereignty of the individual? You know, so what do you do with those kind of states? So early liberals was just said, well, depending on how effective it might be, we can interfere and change those states to make them not despotic from our definition of the term despotic, as in that is in essence not liberal. Anything not liberal, as they say, is despotic. So that was seen as totally fine. But they said, as long as when you go into those states, you don't do so for any other reason except their improvement, the improvement of the people by giving them liberal ideology and changing their way of life to liberalism. That's the only reason you can do it. If you do it for any other reason, that's wrong, that's bad, what have you. Okay. But then later on in kind of liberal thought and in Western thinking, especially with the rise of nationalism and the idea that every nation, which represents its constituent individuals, but defined as one ethno-linguistic group, one group that are people of language speakers, usually of particular language speakers, they have the right of self-determination because they're made up of individuals who each are sovereign individuals, and therefore, as a nation, they should determine themselves as an aggregate, and they should have a state that represents the nation, and hence a nation state. But the problem is then that if that's the case, then no nation state can tell another nation state what to do, because every nation state should have the right to self-determination. But then what if they the only way that they could ever live under in a true domestic self-determination situation, and within their country, the individuals are self-determined by liberal standards, is if the government is despotic, is the government has to be changed. Yep, and you reach that 22 scenario whereby interference from outside is necessary, but it's also wrong from the liberal perspective at the same time. So liberalism says it's necessary when required, and it can also say it's wrong at the same time, leading to this contradiction. And one of the many things I find hilarious, and feel free to quote this as a video, or make a clip of this video if you like, this one bit, but many people from a Muslim background, I'm going to say only from a Muslim background, many people from Muslim background who adopt the kind of colonial mindset of that. So the systems that will change, their educational system will change, or maybe they're just in awe with the West and they just want to imitate this currently militarily superior civilization. They wouldn't be the first people in human history to where a defeated people wants to imitate the militarily superior civilization. In fact, there are sociological predictability because human beings are predictable. One could even say, in that sense, like sheep, it's almost predictable. There'd be those who would imitate the strongest, more powerful civilization. So they become liberal and they tout liberal values and they say, "Oh, I'm a Muslim." At the same time, almost subconsciously, they realize that it's contradictory, but they think it's some kind of a means to advocate their liberalism to their fellow Muslims by saying, "I'm liberal and I'm Muslim at the same time," not realizing the fundamental contradiction. I actually nicknamed them sleepwalkers, because Muslims who've grown up in the post-colonial situations and they're more traditional, but they don't know much about the true depth and sophistication of Islam. They might just be asleep, and they just need to be woken up and enriched and kind of to change their thinking with a more enlightened lens. But these people are sleepwalkers. They're asleep and they're walking into, in essence, kufr, what is a contrary to Islam.
Yep.
And they don't realize it. But at the same time, they say, we're anti-colonial. We're anti-colonial. I say, you are the children of colonialism. They're your parents. Don't insult your parents, right? If it wasn't for them, you wouldn't be liberal, okay? The states, however imperfect the Muslim world is from an Islamic lens, or even from the liberal, how the liberals would judge it, the Muslim world is decidedly secular because of colonialism, right? And the liberals would be crying if colonialism actually didn't occur in the Muslim world and it was more Islamic today. They wouldn't like that. They prefer it to be secular than more Islamic. Let's just put it this way. And it's only secular to the degree it is today because of military invasion, forced imposition of colonialism. Our education system, our Islamic education system wiped out or defunded, in essence, what actually happened. And the Western education system imposed, creating people as Lord Macaulay said about India, in essence, kind of Indian visages, but basically English hearts and English souls, in essence, inside themselves, right? This is what the colonialists created. So this is a situation. And the last point is, I often find it quite risible how many of these kind of liberal da'is, these are people advocates to liberalism from Muslim backgrounds, sleepwalkers, they're so conceited, they feel so superior, or almost imitating the superiority of the Western colonizers who came to these countries in the first place. If only they could see in history how the kind of repetition of the sociological processes that made them liberal in the first place in the past. When the Greeks conquered ancient Israel, many Jews became Hellenic Jews. They adopted Greek philosophy. They changed their own religion. They kind of dropped it in favor of what they viewed as more superior pagan customs and culture, right? And they eventually they were overturned by a rebellion, the Maccabean rebellion, that restored Israel to Mosaic law. But these were, in essence, modernists, or the liberals of their time, although they weren't liberal, but in essence, they were imitating the superior civilization. Same with under Roman occupation. And you know where we get Christianity from? The Christianity that we have today, with those doctrines that are so bizarre to both Muslims and Christians and Jews, Muslims and Jews. Why? It's because Christianity is basically a Judaism that was giving dawah, to inviting people to join it from amongst the Gentiles, Greeks and Romans, and it adopted its culture, the culture of Greeks and Romans, to make it more palatable. So the idea of where you get original sin, where you not even that, the doctrines themselves, the idea of original sin, that the Holy Spirit is the one that changes your heart, not your own actions or choices. Blood sacrifice of Jesus, and that he basically makes you sinless. All these things actually came from different philosophies within Greco-Roman society, and it made Christianity, you're right, it made it successful. People said, hey, you've given me a spiritual reason to follow the same things I was following in my more spiritually empty, maybe kind of Greco-Roman world at the time. So we're fascinated by this, much like you get this kind of popular Buddhism that many Hollywood celebrities follow, even though they follow only on a superficial level, and it really just gives them a justification for doing the same things they were doing, except with a spiritual, some kind of pseudo-spiritual, kind of backing towards it, and Christianity became successful. But it became so successful, this approach, that the message of Jesus was lost and required a new prophet to come to re-inject monotheism and re-establish the correct religion, the original religion of mankind from we have in time of Adam alayhi salam. That's the cost of this assimilation process that happens. So, and the Muslim, or these liberals who adopt liberalism, they don't know any better. Many of them, some are very arrogant and conceited, much like their colonialist masters. And I find it ironic that they will curse colonialism. But the colonialism is, in essence, their parents. They are the children of colonialism. But I think one of your colleagues maybe gave a more colorful denouncement of these individuals. I think you know who I'm referring, the tract that I'm referring to. But in essence, it's pretty much saying the same thing. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there. As for colonialism, now going back to it to kind of really show Dr. Oppy, in essence, was seriously inaccurate, and leading to the idea of what is practice and what is theory. Okay, so I'll deal with that first.
Okay, so just before we get into that, I thought it was a very good point, the way that you explained it about I mean, there's something that I was watching recently, but it's linked to the debate that happened on Friday, and it's these two, they seem unrelated, but they're not. In the Oxford Union debate about patriotism, when you were speaking out against it, you raised a very interesting point about the Syrian conflict. You basically said what was happening was there was this mindset, let's look at whether the people that we want to support hold the same values as us, irrelevant of the human rights violations. And when they do want to, and that's something that you referred to earlier on in this discussion tonight, that when they do want to intervene, they'll put this veneer of some sort of moral reason behind it, or else people won't support it. But in essence, this is a continuation of that colonial mindset, which is that, okay, so do these people hold the same values as us? That's what's more important than any of the human rights discussion. So even what you've just said about the people who, and then, they're referred to with different terms, but we all know of the people who are continuously speaking about human rights. They also hold very liberal values and are liberalizing Islam. And at the same time, they're very anti-colonial, when you can't have those things together, because clearly there is a conflict between holding on to that, the classical liberal ideas of civilizing the barbaric nations, and the idea of human rights. Because if you are to, apply liberal ideas to a population of people who hold traditional values, values which majority of humans have lived for, it's not going to happen with bread in one hand and roses in the other. There's going to be bloodshed, there's going to be anarchy, there's going to be the challenge to the traditional societal system. And therefore I feel sometimes liberals, what they'll try and do is they'll try and shy away from the enforcement side of liberalism, whether it comes to international intervention or whether it comes to, like Professor Oppy was referring to when it came to tobacco. He said, oh, it's just nudges, right? Well, what if those nudges don't work? Like the prohibition was not a nudge. it was an enforcement.
I mean, that's something I actually raised with Oppy in the debate. I said that in essence, you've just proved my point. The state actually not neutral. For the state to take a stance on alcohol or cocaine is taking a stance on what is the meaning of the good, or how good is defined. Because the individual might say, I only care about enjoying myself with this cocaine or alcohol, and you can't be harassing my lifestyle, and you can't be prohibiting my lifestyle. Now, he tried to say, oh, but surely everyone might also believe that health is also a good idea, and these things are not the best for your health, alcohol or cocaine. And then my counterpoint, I think, I don't know if I'm going to play or not, but my counterpoint was simply, you're forgetting that people's definition of good allows them to prioritize. So if someone says that I want to prioritize my live now, I want to live now, die later, or even if it's sooner, that's how I think. That's how I order my priorities. You can't tell me that that's a wrong ordering of my priorities, because that's how I define good, right? They might say you only live once, YOLO, right? They say, right, you only live once, you also only die once. But yes, and he couldn't really have anything to say. He didn't have anything to say about that, because he got caught out in essence. Actually defending the state interfering in a definition of the good, or a good lifestyle, and imposing it on people. To mention what you said about the liberals kind of foreign interventions and so on and so forth. You know what was quite fascinating was that some of the right wing, who are kind of, some of them are fiscally conservative, so they believe that they don't want to spend money unnecessarily. They think that we shouldn't bother about civilizing other countries. We should only care about defending our own country. And so you get this situation where, like Donald Trump, of all the people you think Donald Trump actually wants the American soldiers to come back to America and stop spending money for other people's countries, right? And then you had the liberals, the left wing, who'd be saying, no, but we have this civilizing mission, or no, we have this, you could say, guaranteeing peace and stability across the world, being the world's policeman, right? This is the new liberal way of how they define themselves. But I think it's telling when you mentioned about the hypocrisy and hypocrisy on the Syrian intervention, and they said, like, well, before we support any particular rebellion against this dictator, which we wouldn't like this dictator, we don't like this dictator. What is the ideology of the rebels? Because that determines, no matter how popular they are, or how much support they'd get, we don't want to be supporting rebels whose ideologies we don't approve of or we disagree with. It's not basically liberal like us. This reminds me of the recent situation.
And conversely, they are the same people who would support liberal rebels or liberal instigators, even if they use tactics or things which are violating the general notion of human rights. So on the flip side, the other thing is also true, which is why the human rights and sadly human rights advocates have now become into they've almost become synonymous with the liberal interpretation, when that's not necessarily the case. But that's why there's this constant tension. And I think raising it the way that you did during the debate and the way that you had this pushback from Oppy, I think on this point, Abdullah, I think maybe we should just have a debate just on this, about the history of liberalization of the world and colonization, because you can't enjoy the fruits of a garden unless you know how they were planted, were slaves used. What on earth basically took place in order for these things to actually happen?
Well, I mean, I was going to raise something which I think is indicative, especially in the Muslim world, of many colonialized mindsets in the Muslim world as well as internationally. So the idea that there's an occupation of a foreign country, most liberals would say that's wrong. The idea of occupying a foreign country is wrong because you're denying the people of that country self-determination. You say, okay. So then would you, to these liberals, until these liberal sleepwalkers in the Muslim world, or that infest the Muslim world, unfortunately, we'd say, well, what about the example of the Taliban? Okay, so that was quite interesting as an example, because you had a indigenous movement who, in essence, prevailed against an occupying power. The power retreated, left the country, and then suddenly all these liberals who would always be against occupation, military wars around the world, say, oh no, but like, oh, this is a dark day for us because the Taliban are going to get into power and we don't like what the Taliban have done, and so on and so forth. And I noticed one thing, which is as imperfect as the Taliban are on a number of things, but if there was a state that was secular, was secular, and the liberal had to choose, and the state was secular, but it had some oppression in it. It had, like, which is many of the Muslim countries in the Muslim world. The liberal would say it has some problems, but at least it's secular. We can work with that. We can slowly try to improve it, make it more liberal gradually. So the secular is like the undercoat. Liberalism is the top coat that goes under the undercoat. We have a basis. Interestingly, many people who call themselves Muslim never thought of that when concerning the Taliban. They didn't think to themselves, like, well, look, there's a lot of problems with the Taliban, a lot of problems in their past, and mistakes they've made, mistaken policies that show that they didn't maybe fully understood the sophistication of Islamic law. But at least maybe they why didn't they say to themselves, at least they have some kind of inclination towards Islam. We can work with that. We can try to educate them. We can try to go there, advocate for a correct application of Islamic law with wisdom, with mercy, on the Medinan model. Many of them might agree and change their policies. You can actually change them because at least we have the common basis of we all want Islam. Okay, many of these people they wouldn't think like that. Many people call themselves Muslim wouldn't view the Taliban's at least ostensible inclination towards Islam to be something that could be built upon. Instead, it was this is the worst thing that could ever happen. It's almost like they prefer, if Donald Trump was the president of Afghanistan right now, then they'd have the Taliban by comparison, by how much they were gnashing their teeth and beating their breasts with grief at this. But you take any secular state in the Muslim world and they'll say it's imperfect, we've got issues with it, yeah, but at least it has this basis that we can work with, despite the fact they call themselves Muslims. So the fact that Islam does not, the sharing the basis of Islam with a people does not enliven their hearts to work and cooperate in that good, shows you where their true tastes lie. It's not with Islam at all. It's with the colonial project, right? Even though they might call themselves Muslim, and even though they might be against foreign occupation. And you mentioned about terrorism around the world and how it actually depends on the ideology of the group, whether it's defined as terrorism, right? So let's take an example that no one would think to call a terrorist. So we say Nelson Mandela, right? And the ANC, his political party, everyone forgets the militant faction of the ANC, Umkhonto Msizwe, which blew up, which detonated bombs in shopping malls, in restaurants, cafes, killing women and children in the fight against apartheid. They were called freedom fighters. Yeah. After Nelson Mandela's group stopped being communist, by the way, then they got called freedom fighters and supported. And no one would call Nelson Mandela a terrorist. Apparently, Nelson Mandela he was still on a terrorist list, or a no-fly list, even after he became a president of South Africa. Quite fun, ironically, he was only kind of taken off that list a few years before he died, because he was still on that terrorist list during his communist days. So this is the double standard, and I can cite him. I can cite anti-communist Western supported militia groups in South America who were CIA trained. This is not disputed, by the way. This is actually well known, but were taught torture and terror attack techniques, interrogation techniques, which were actually so nasty that many of the some CIA trainers actually just didn't want to teach, didn't want to actually teach this, or even work with these people. But others, of course, did. So that kind of tells you that terrorism in the West is defined mostly by the ideology you fight for, rather than the methodology you use. Of course, as Muslims, we would say that anyone who targets non-combatants is going against the commands of Islam, regardless of whatever cause that they are fighting for. But liberalism is a little more fluid, because utilitarianism could argue essentially the ends can justify the means if you can create greater overall pleasure in the long run by doing a little bit of evil in the short term, which basically is terrorism in essence. And think of the ticking time bomb scenario, by the way. Do you remember when the CIA were talking about, the CIA report was leaked about torture, and the debate you had in America at that time between people who were for and against torture was, those who were for torture said it saves lives. Those who were against torture said, but how do we know it works? That was their argument. So if it does work, it's okay, right? You'd use it. So anyway, there's that. So inshallah, I think maybe the only last thing to talk about, maybe we can raise it, is the issue of theory versus practice, Islam versus liberalism. How do we tell the difference between theory and practice in Islam, and how do we tell the difference between theory and practice in liberalism?
And I think just before you get into that, there was a questioner who asked about excesses, right? And maybe that's the way to address this point about how much can you blame Islam for the excesses of the adherents of Islam, and likewise for liberalism. And one of the points which I felt was, I'm sure Oppy is more nuanced than this. When it came to Islam, he used, for example, something the Ottomans did, and then he used that against Islam as a religion, right? However, when you raise the whole colonization, which was being propagated by their thinkers, then it was like, okay, no, that's against the actual theory. Now, we as Muslims, we would actually have that very powerful a mechanism that if anybody believes in attacking human dignity, human rights, basic human rights that people have, targeting innocent civilians, all these things, we can always go back to something and then just completely push back these types of ideologies. But one point where you kept on repeating, but he never responded to, is, okay, where is the holy book of liberalism? Where are the limits? Who defines these things? And it was almost feeling like he was saying, look, we've got it together. Look, we've got it together. But he wasn't actually saying what are those limits and how you would adjudicate between two disputing liberal ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I could have got a French intellectual. I could have got a. I said it during the debate. I could have got a classical liberal or a libertarian, which is like a neoclassical liberal, if you'd like to view it like that, on board, who would actually say that social liberalism is not liberal. They would takfir, excommunicate social liberalism. They say that the state is interfering in people's lives, and it is no longer liberal. A state should only be a police force, a fire brigade at best, and an army for defending against foreign aggression. Only those three things. That's what some classical liberal or libertarians would say today. And anything beyond that is tyranny and despotism. So they would say that the current system, even the United States of America, is tyranny and despotism and isn't the liberalism of the past, because it has gone against its original values and is now interfering, meddling, regulating, based on values determined by politicians and administrators, not by the conceptions of good of the individual people. So they would tell Oppy, and Oppy, he did a kind of a volte-face. He went from this conception of liberalism that a classical liberal could get behind to say, oh no, but we've evolved it now. I think he said it kind of evolved, or it changed into social liberalism, which is what I've been saying already anyway. So in a way, he almost agreed with me without realizing to get away from my criticism of liberalism, and the excesses that happen within liberalism, he fell into the trap I said that liberalism eventually will do, which is it will adopt the concept of the good, right? Yeah. So out of the pan and into the fire, intellectually speaking, for Oppy's kind of positions. So let's kind of, I think this could be a final, really defining point between the difference of Islam and liberalism.
What we could do, we could play your summary, or we could get you to speak now and then play your summary, because I thought your summary was quite well worded.
Well, we could play the summary, inshallah, and then we can just discuss.
Yeah,
discuss it, and I can elaborate some other examples.
Yeah.
And make them want things they actually didn't need, and will not ultimately bring them happiness anyway. So so this goes back to something that Professor Oppy said right at the very beginning, which is, liberalism doesn't tell people what is good, but it allows society to chaotically tell people what is good, and in such a state of nature, quote unquote, but not a natural state. And in such a state of nature, the strongest will oppress the weakest. And the whole point of Sharia is to protect the weak from the strong, and to prevent the social space from being dominated by the manipulators, which cause so much suffering, depression, anxiety, body dysmorphia, broken marriages, and narcissism. All these proven and demonstrated by studies to be highly correlate in Western states with a long history of applying liberalism. So that would be, in essence, you could say, a summating point of one of my main arguments throughout this entire discussion.
Yeah. So I think overall, that was a really good way of summarizing. You started off with, they have no conception of the good, and then all of these implications and consequences, which they're recognizing. Islam has a solution when liberalism cannot even agree on how much state intervention there should actually be. And especially when it comes to objectification, the sex industry, the porn industry, the exploitation of women, and problems even that young teenage girls go through now with bulimia and anxiety and all these things. There's literally not even a discussion on it, because then these liberal societies will start sounding pretty much like Muslim societies in terms of male-female interaction and objectification and stuff.
Oh, I mean, indeed, these are issues that Graham just didn't want tackle, because, as I said, his strategy was what he thought was very simple, which is he'll go in and say that liberalism is the only way that can solve the non-convergence problem. But as I highlighted, that there is a non-convergence problem with political philosophy itself. So socialists, Marxists, post-Marxists, neo-Marxists, conservatives, neoconservatives, of course, classical liberals or libertarians, and of course now you have social liberals and of different waves as well. All these different jostling, and social democrats as well, and of course let's not forget fascists, which are also part of the Enlightenment tradition. So these are all of these traditions, believe it or not, all of these traditions believe in freedom, the freedom of the individual. The individual should be liberated. All of them, every single one. You even think, well, even Marxism, even like in essence communism, yes, but its method is just different. They differ all on methods, but the idea of the liberating the individual is different. The idea of what is equality is different. Is it equality under the law? Is it equality in opportunity? Is it equality in the outcome? Right? Which one? So is it equality in law, in opportunity, or the outcome must be the same? Which one is it? Okay. Do we have to have 50% gender quotas in rich CEOs boards of corporations, because that's an equal outcome? Or is it just equal opportunity, and or is it equal under the law, and maybe let a more meritocratic society arise, because maybe meritocracy is better for the society where you have the best rising to the top, even if they're not all the same, a particular set of attributes or characteristics, let's just say. Should the state be involved in distributing the wealth? Should the state control national resources or not? Should the state be involved in giving to everybody, or everything that they require under a fixed wage, or given to them according to their means or their output? Or is it just the state should be laissez-faire and just let people take care of it themselves? Or should the state just come for the poorest? How do we judge the poorest, of course? And where do we find the money to even pay the poor? And will that make people work shy and not do any work if we give them money? All this difference of opinion that is amongst the West on every single policy you can think of. There is multiple opinions, and some of them are very radically opposed to each other, and to the point of violence. They will engage in violence. Now, in the West, it can come with, in America, for example, you have a movement called the Sovereign Citizens, who are in essence classical liberals. They believe the state is oppressive. You could say they're almost like the Khawarij of liberalism. They believe, although they would say they're more like the Salaf, they're like following the Salaf, the original liberalism. So they think that the state has gone awry and can be fought against. And the kind of internal FBI documents or some reports were showing that they actually feared them more than they feared any other movement in the United States of America. They want to believe that any American can literally opt out of being in America, not leave America, but just say, I'm no longer a citizen of this particular government, and I'm going to do my own law in my own ranch or area or state. You can't do that, of course, but that leads to standoff with the police, potential terrorist activities, fighting against the state, things like that. So these are issues. And then you've got the bigger, the more well-known wars between the Enlightenment followers of philosophers, followers of Enlightenment philosophy, the Cold War with its hot proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam and all over South America, Muslim world here and there, but wasn't that major in the Muslim world. This was Eastern Europe and things like that. And of course, fascism. I mentioned that during the discussion with Dr. Oppy, that in the West you have this booms and busts of the economic cycle. Yep. So some people thought, and I was actually advocating. I kind of put this forward as a hypothesis in 2013. That the same occurs in liberal society. And so you have the liberal economic system going up and down, and you have the same situation in in the liberal social system or whatever for its society, where you have fascism arise when the conditions decline in liberal states, usually at the same time as the economy declines. You see the rise of popularism, and you see the rise of ultranationalism, and the idea that the individuals have been so chaotic that they have to be reined in and made patriotic to the state, and the state is the only one that will save the society or save everybody from their declined economic state or social state or what have you. And usually they'll blame a minority for not being patriotic enough as a scapegoat. So this has occurred multiple times in Western history, not just the Nazi Germany, by the way. And there are the rise of far right movements in Europe. Their parliamentary systems are more on the continental system, which was more purist about being representative of the people, and therefore you see greater shares of the parliament being taken by the far right, whereas in the parliamentary system in the UK is designed to be anti-democratic because it doesn't trust the people to rule themselves, and that was something that came out in the debate itself.
Well,
I think,
actually, sorry, just wanted you to highlight something, right? So when Oppy tried to define liberalism as a general negation of religion or religious intervention, and then he used Britain as an example, and you actually pointed out actually it worked against him. That was a really good point.
Yeah, he doesn't understand the historical quirkiness of Britain. Arguably, some might say the first liberal state is a religious state, based state in which is the UK, which is a monarchy, and these things are kept in place because many of the Enlightenment thinkers just couldn't trust these new formulas coming out by Enlightenment philosophers to say, let's just reorganize all of society based on these ideal formulas that we've devised. And many of the Enlightenment thinkers were saying, well, actually, you know what? Maybe we don't know enough of humans as we first thought. Let's not give too much trust to these formulas, and let's maybe preserve some social institutions to act as a check against to act as a check against the potential excesses of these Enlightenment ideas we're concocting. So they didn't trust their own children. These Enlightenment ideas the philosophers didn't trust their own children, and that's why you get many anti-democratic quotations by these founding fathers in the West, and where you got the origin of conservatism from. You saw Edmund Burke saw the French Revolution, very bloody and nasty, loads of beheadings. They built a machine to make it more efficient. The beheadings were called the guillotine. Fun fact: France was executing people with the guillotines till 1976. By the way, so that's and it's an enlightened Western civilized state. So there's it's funny how they're not uncivilized for beheading people because they use a machine and because it's France. So whereas the many Western liberals will be, even French liberals will decry all the people around the world for doing the same thing that their own country was doing within living memory. Anyway, I digress. So I think to really finally answer the point where I mentioned about colonialism and liberal thinkers with quotations, I promised some quotations. So I want to kind of give some. So that's why I was disappointed with Dr. Graham Oppy, because at first I felt he thought that John Stuart Mill wasn't supporting colonialism, or maybe he thought that John Stuart Mill supported colonialism because he had some business ventures that involved like the East India Company or so on, but he didn't put it as part of his philosophy. So he said, some American founding fathers had slaves, but it doesn't mean that their philosophy can be used to justify slavery. So maybe that's the same with John Stuart Mill. I pointed out merely that, but if John Stuart Mill's own books on theory, on political philosophy, is where he advocates colonialism, using the same arguments in the same continuum of flow of his argumentation, is it really just his personal a personal taste of his, conditioned by his history, and not something he saw as completely concordant and emanating from the political philosophy of his you so laud and stand in awe of? So let me give you some quotations. So in his book on liberty, which is the seminal book of John Stuart Mill concerning what would later be social liberalism, although some classical liberals love that book too. So I'll read out some quotations for you, and I advise all of you to read it and in context, so I'm not accused of just cutting and pasting, but you can clearly see that he's making this kind of argument. So first he argues that liberal government is not for everybody, that you can have a government that is despotic, imposed upon people. If it's to make them civilized, eventually it will make them more civilized. So he says this in his book on liberty. Despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement, the means justified by actually affecting the end. Liberty, as a principle, has no application to any state of things anterior to the time when mankind have become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. Until then, there is nothing for them but the implicit obedience to an Akbar or a Charlemagne, if they are so fortunate as to find one. And then he says, as soon as mankind has attained the capacity to be guided and improved by conviction or persuasion, then, which he says, a period long since reached in all nations with whom we need here concern ourselves, then compulsion, either in direct form or in that of pains and penalties for non-compliance, is no longer admissible as a means to their own good and justifiable only for the security of others. So he says that until people become liberal, they need to have, they can have despots imposed upon them to civilize, to make them civilized. And then he discusses later on in that book, he talks about some Christian, like Mormons who are practicing polygamy, and whether you should interfere with what they're doing, or use a state intervention, even by an invasion, or can foreign states intervene if they disagree with what the Mormons are doing with polygamy, and so on and so forth. Here's what he says. Right? Here's what he says. So on the whole, he's saying that no, but there's certain conditions. He says it is difficult to see on what principles, but those of tyranny, they can be prevented from living under what laws they please, provided they commit no aggression on other nations and allow perfect freedom of departure to those who are dissatisfied with their ways. And a recent writer, in some respects of considerable merit, proposes, to use his own words, not a crusade, but a civilizard against such communities. And then he says that he disagrees with this, and he says that as long as there are people in there that don't invite help, so as long as there are no, let's say, liberals in a state saying, please come invade this country, the majority of people aren't liberal, and I don't want to live under this illiberal state. If that's not the case, then maybe you can't intervene. But if there are people saying, I want to be liberal, I want to be under a liberal regime, could you please come to this country and take it over for me? They could get involved in that. But clearly he said here that only tyranny. So if he judges a state to be under tyranny, they can get involved, right? But if everyone is consenting, everybody just loves the law of that land, and no one complains about it, then yeah, maybe you shouldn't go into that land and invade it and take it over and change them. But if there are people who disagree with it, and they're not leaving and they're asking for help, or the state is ruling by tyranny that you judge to be tyranny, by the liberal understanding of tyranny, you can actually get involved. But then he says more kind of very specifically in a book called Considerations of Representative Government. Okay, so this is a book on representative government. This is, again, part of his political philosophy. Chapter 19, he talks about actual colonies, so the colonies, Western colonies of other countries, which are called dependencies. Thus far, of the dependencies whose population is in a sufficiently advanced state to be fitted for representative government, but there are others which have not attained that state, and which, if held at all, must be governed by the dominant country or by persons delegated for that purpose by it. This mode of government is as legitimate as any other, if it is the one which is in the existing state of civilization of the subject people most facilitates their transition to a higher state of improvement. There are, as we have seen, conditions of society in which a vigorous despotism is in itself the best mode of government for training the people in what is specifically wanting to render them capable of higher civilization. and he discusses about how Western countries have taken charge of other subject peoples around the world, and they have now a duty to civilize these people by whatever means necessary to effect the end of civilizing these people. So these are this is basically John Stuart Mill. Have other quotations. This is John Stuart Mill on the treatment of barbarous nations. I use the word barbarism. He says, to suppose that the same international customs and the same rules of international morality can obtain between one civilized nation and another, and between civilized nations and barbarians, is a grave error, and one which no statesman can fall into, however it may be those who from a safe and unresponsible position criticize statesmen. So he says, you might feel free to criticize the politicians for doing colonialism, or basically not being fair with countries which you deem to be barbarous, but politicians can't make that mistake. So the people, you can feel free to criticize the politicians if you want for doing these policies, but from his understanding of liberalism, or the necessity of liberty, the politicians have to implement this policy of really not using the same international customs, i.e., liberal internationalism, and so on. And he makes this more. He doubles down on this. I'll give you to characterize any conduct whatsoever towards a barbarous people as a violation of the law of nations only shows that he who so speaks has never considered the subject. A violation of great principles of morality it may easily be, but barbarians have no rights as a nation, except a right to such treatment as may, at the earliest possible period, fit them for becoming one. So this is across his books, and I can give you more quotations from these books. I picked a selection of them. John Stuart Mill's political philosophical and political philosophical writings. This is part and parcel of his argument. He makes a justification for it. He talks about how it's no point treating what he deems to be non-civilized people, and he mentions India and Algeria, by the way, for those of you who want to know what nations is he referring to, like some cannibals on some desert island. No, he's referring to India, places like India, North America, the native Indians, and of course Algeria. So and that's just him. I can bring Tocqueville, who talked about the necessary scorched earth tactics by the French occupation force in Algeria against women and children to hold down the country from these barbarians, and ultimately to civilize this country for their own benefit. Because utilitarians will simply argue that, look, you might, if you have to imprison people now so that their children and their children's children, their children's children will be free, then the greater utility is that their freedom. Because the people right now, they won't respond to discussion, meaning they're not accepting the dawah of liberalism, right? They're not accepting it. Then you're unreasonable. You're not susceptible to discussion and conviction by philosophy. So we're going to invade you, impose the system. He said there, as I mentioned by quotation, use potentially despotic means, as long as those means are only for the betterment of those people until they become mature enough to then be given their own state and independence, and so on and so on and so forth. So John Stuart Mill said this. Dr. Graham Oppy, I don't know why he was affronted by me first saying John Stuart Mill said it, and then to say that it's not part of liberal theory. Well, I think John Stuart Mill would disagree with him because he's making it part of his liberal theory. And this really brings us back to what I mentioned in the debate or discussion about theory versus practice. Liberalism, there's no Quran of liberalism. There's no Bible of liberalism. Everything's up for debate. There's only the general thing that connects them is a spirit to want to give liberty to or freedom to mankind of some kind. That's what makes something liberal in essence, because they don't agree with anything else. How you do it and in what way that looks like, whether that looks like your children having the right as individuals to be having a neutral education, which requires telling them that same-sex marriage is a morally equal life path and life choice to different sex marriage, that's freedom of the individual child to free them from having and they can make up their own mind in the future as to whether they want to pursue same-sex marriage or they want to pursue different sex marriage or no marriage at all. That's the argument they have made. Male circumcision, I brought this up in the debate with Graham Oppy, right? A practice that Muslims and Jews practice. Okay, I feel that he doesn't want to speak out against it, but guess what? There are liberals who do, because they merely said, well, we're all against female genital mutilation, quote unquote. I once spoke to a liberal about this, and I said, well, what about women who feel the need that they have to have an aesthetic genitalia, and they go to plastic surgeons to mutilate their genitals to subscribe to some concept of genital beauty of some kind? Like, what is the Platonic form of that? I don't even want to go into that, but he'd say no, but that's elective. He said that's elective genital mutilation, so we wouldn't call it genital mutilation. And I said, elective meaning it's done by the consent of an adult. And I said, well, but then why do you call it genital mutilation in one case and not genital mutilation in other case when they both involve mutilation of the genitals?
Yeah.
And one could even argue that I mean, those who are against genital mutilation, who argue that anything that involves cutting or changing the genitals in some way, even radical ways, like might be involved in transsexual operations. Why is that not genital mutilation? They say, well, it's not genital mutilation because it's done consensually. I say, well, genital mutilation doesn't talk about consent. It talks about the act itself, not whether it was done consensually or not. So you're using it's liberal rhetoric they used different practices. But here's the thing: when they say, okay, female genital mutilation, which occurs in certain traditional but not Islamic, not from Islamic basis, but from traditional societies, Christian, even pre-pharaonic societies, for 3,000-year-old practices, which basically engage in clitorectomy. So those things, which is something that is prohibited basically, but the scholars have clearly prohibited in Islam. But they'll say, okay, they'll say that's wrong. Fine, we agree, not because we're liberal, but because Islam says it's wrong, because the text and the jurisprudence on that text produces an understanding that shows that it's clearly morally wrong and incorrect for us. Okay, but then they say, well, if it's wrong for girls and we believe in equality, right, it has to be wrong for men or boys too. So circumcision to boys must be then male genital mutilation and must be stamped out and prohibited. Now, Graham Oppy didn't want to comment on that. I brought that up as a case, and I brought it up that would a German court tried to actually then ban it, and they made a ban, and then it got reversed because
the Jewish community basically pointed out.
Yeah, the Jewish community in Germany, and like, how can a liberal say that's not part of that's not a liberal argument? You're defending the right, they'll say, you're defending the right of children to have bodily integrity until they reach the age they can consent to make such permanent changes to their body, for example. They could say this, and they do, and they're increasingly saying this. But if that is imposed, that means that Jews and Christians, Muslims, maybe some Seventh-day Adventists, Christians, would not be able to practice their religion in their understanding of their religion, and this would be a yet another liberal prohibition of a religious practice in the West. So Graham Oppy really.
Sorry to cut you. But then again, this would be a contradiction in terms of his claim that a liberal society allows plural understandings of the comprehensive good. Because from an Islamic perspective, you would say, well, the comprehensive good is XYZ. Christians would say XYZ. So it's not possible. And I think that's one of the most powerful things about this discussion that you had with Oppy, was that whichever way you slice the onion, you have to, as a liberal, take one conception of good and prioritize that over the others, unless you're just going to go into a state of paralysis. You just have to do that eventually.
Well, indeed, and I then kind of use an argument to turn the tables against Dr. Graham Oppy about let's just say pluralism. So I said that in essence, Islam is actually more pluralistic than liberalism in many cases, because we don't believe in one law for all. We believe in a plurality. Well, Islam doesn't implement a plurality of systems, rather that Muslims are non-interfering in the legal systems of, let's say, Jews and Christians. On Zoroastrians, there's ikhtilaf on issue on polytheists and pagans of what have you, but non-Arabian pagans. But basically, some say, yeah, they can do their practices. Like Hanafis would say that non-Arabian pagans can practice their practices. And what would this mean for mulhids, mulhidun, atheists, and others? They might be under the rubric of polytheists, of being mushriks in essence. They should just be a kind of mushrik. Allahu alam, that's for scholars to look into, and of course, classically speaking, they have. So what Islam does is quite simple. Is because the purpose of what Islam is that the voluntary worship and recognition of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by mankind means that as Muslims, we can't expect non-Muslims to be compelled to be Muslim, because that defeats the purpose of life of Muslims, of humans, which is we need to voluntarily worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and embrace and bear witness to him. But in liberalism, because they believe in equality, equality becomes conformity, so that everyone must conform to one law system because it's equal. They say the only way you can be equal is if we all follow the same law system. So whether you like that law system or not, you need to be under that law system that we devise, which in practice is the majority or the majority's representatives. When it's in Islam, we don't tell Christians what to do. If they want to preach about the Bible, if they want to even preach that Islam is against the Bible, or Islam is, which like John of Damascus did in the 8th century, I believe, he preached against Islam. He published a book, on the heresies of the Ishmaelites, I think, a chapter of the book, rather, and he wasn't the only one. It was non-interference. Their jizya guarantees they're not we have to not interfere in their society. They're given a contract with us, with the Muslims. They pay taxes for the protection of the state as a contract citizen, much like, actually, ironically, the Enlightenment idea is the same thing. You pay tax to the state for protection, in essence, for those who are able to pay it, though, and only males, not women and children, because they're not military age and they're not expected to protect themselves militarily speaking, and because non-Muslim males are not expected to join the Muslim army, they pay a waiver tax, which is in essence the jizya. They don't, but there is cases where non-Muslims said, I don't want to pay jizya, I'll join as a Muslim, as a reservist in the Muslim army. Then there was I think Umar Abdul Aziz actually accepted that from a Christian Arab tribe in Syria. Anyway, I digress. So the reason why I mentioned that was not to argue, we all love tolerance for liberals' sake, and we're more tolerant than you. No. It was to argue that in dealing with the non-convergence problem, Islam is actually better at that.
Yes,
at the non-convergence problem. That was the reason I said it. Right? It was I attempt to deal with this, and I raise you the Islamic response, which is, imagine giving communities their own, allowing them their own law system to resolve their own disputes amongst themselves according to whatever concept of the good that they agree with themselves. And someone asked me, what do you do if someone like a Christian commits a crime against a Muslim, or vice versa? There is usually a kind of negotiated understanding between Muslims and a particular non-Muslim community at the point of its incorporation into the Islamic Caliphate that we saw historically. There was a contract or an arrangement that was written on paper how disputes would be resolved, according to what basis, and that was always referred to. That document was always referred to going ahead. So it was negotiated, and then once with a representative of the community, once it was agreed, that would be the basis for the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims. So that was it. And I think last but not least, and just really the final point was Graham mentioned very briefly Sunni and Shia disagreements or conflicts or what have you, and I wanted to kind of tell this to everybody, many Muslims who actually have fallen into the trap of thinking that are we in some kind of war of religion or something, like the European wars of religion that occurred in basically 15th, 16th, 17th centuries.
Yeah.
In the Muslim world, right? There's a Shia community in Saudi Arabia. There's a Sunni community in Iran. They're not being rounded up, subject to inquisition, and routinely tortured en masse and forced to convert or massacred en masse. Right? That's not happening. If it was like Europe in the 16th, 17th centuries, that's what would happen. That's what was happening back then. Okay, what you see in the Muslim world today, there's no Sunni Shia wars of religion ever since perhaps the Safavid takeover of Persia. But usually the Ottomans and the Persians fought on territory, not really on religion, because the Ottomans were fighting the Mamluks. The Mamluks were Sunni as well, so it makes no difference. It was just a fight of dynasties. And as I keep pointing out to people, that the Shia shrines in Iraq were actually at one point looked after by the Ottomans, because the Shias of Iraq were Ottoman citizens or part of the Muslim Millah, which was a categorization of, the Muslims would be under one Millah, and then you have Christians, the Christian Millah, and the Jewish Millah, and so on and so forth. So we didn't have that historical experience. What you're happening today is you have countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran and many others who are having, in essence, nationalist disagreements and are making religion a slave to nationalism, and in essence trying to say we need to fight the Persians because they're spreading their ideology. And it's like, sorry, what countries have been invaded by the Persians? Where are the forced conversions of Sunnis? Likewise, many in Iran say we have to fight the Saudis or limit their influence because the Saudis are spreading Wahhabism and killing Shias around the world. Where are the massacres where are the systematic massacres of Shias and inquisitions and things you saw in Europe happening in Saudi Arabia, with a very strong Shia community in East Saudi Arabia and so on and so forth. So, and of course, what about the Houthis in Yemen? And it's like, well, the Houthis have been living there for centuries. They're actually Zaydi Shia. They're not even 12 Shia they're not Iranian 12 Shia. They're very close to Hanafi, some people say. It's got nothing to do with difference of opinion and religion, because none of these states are really based on or mandated to act based on their school of thought. So that's something that Graham Oppy mentioned very briefly. He didn't say wars of religion. He just said Sunni and Shia, and then he left it like that. He didn't elaborate, and hence I didn't really pick up on it to comment. But I felt that it's something that just needs to be kind of dealt with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to just add that even if we did have something like that, and you could say the Safavid takeover of Persia and their forced, imposition of, their ideas, very un-Islamic ideas, upon a population that did not want to accept them. That's something that we could actually use something very clear. We could use the Quran, we could use the Sunnah, we could use these things as adjudicators. We could say, well, this is not allowed. You are doing this, you're doing that. This is not allowed within our religion. And to a large extent, I think on the minimum, the comparison that's usually made between the European wars that were going on and the Muslim civilization is, we could say, well, to a large extent, we've resolved a lot of our disputes. We've actually fought a lot of our disputes ideologically, right? So you'll find texts and texts and texts of Muslims going back and forth. You are doing this thing is not allowed because it's not in the Quran, it's not in the Sunnah, it's not the whatever. But then amongst the Europeans, you don't find that much of this refutation culture. You find more bloodshed, right? So, we can say in many ways our heretics, right? the people who believed in the eternality of the universe, who espoused other sort of ideas. They continued to be productive scientists within the Muslim civilization. They weren't killed. We had all sorts of people espousing all sorts of ideas, which were then, why would Imam Ghazali write a book refuting these people if they could simply be executed? I really don't find these comparisons fair, and I feel it's this type of colonial mindset. I'm not accusing Dr. Oppy of this. I'm just saying just generally there's this colonial mindset where you people are too impoverished in your thinking to have experiences of your own. Here, let me take my European baggage of religion versus science and religion versus religion and impose it upon the entire world. And now you will understand your Islamic history through this European this supra sort of understanding imposed upon your history. And we as Muslims, we have to simply say, no, we will not accept that. And one thing which I'm glad you did in the debate as well is, when he raised something about the Ottomans, which was, I'm not sure about the details, but it just didn't sound right. From an Islamic perspective, you simply pointed out, well, it's not about what the Ottomans did at a certain period. it's about what Islam actually allows, and that, I think, is the biggest a point which is missed out in these discussions. We can always go back to something, when you guys can never go back to that thing because you don't have it. And two, even the thinkers who are associated with liberalism, when they espouse ideas about colonization, you have no reason to reject that these are not liberal ideas. So you need to own it. Like we as Muslims, in many ways, we will say, yes, the Khawarij are a real thing. And they are people who the Prophet ﷺ spoke about. This is how we deal with them. But a liberal will say about their Khawarij, oh, they're not liberal. Oh, they've got nothing to do with us. They're not a byproduct of our civilization. They came from space, right? We will not say that. We'll say, actually, no, these are byproducts of, or people that have just gone off the hook, right? Because we're running out of time, I thought it'd be a good time to just do a quick sort of summary about the courses that you're doing, which are a lot more advanced, because I believe even this debate is still, you're just sort of getting your feet wet in terms of these ideas, and many of these things weren't defined. So the courses where people can sign up and why it's important to be equipped to take on these types of ideologies.
Sure. Well, yeah, so basically, I mentioned quite a few things in this debate stroke discussion. It's really just a teaser, not even a trailer, but a teaser to really understanding the issues of Western political philosophy, also Islamic political philosophy, the understanding of how Islam solves problems, practical problems, and the affairs of society, manages and organizes society to create the most harmonious society that can be achieved. Not a utopia, but I always call it an optopia, the optimum condition, but not. You can never have a utopia because of free will, humans' free will, and we're always gonna have munafiqeen and hypocrites and things like that. That's always part of the human condition that they're going to arise in society. So I basically I'm part of the department for Occidentology. This the objective study of the West, not Occidentalism, but Occidentology at the Quran Institute. And we have a number of courses. One was called the Usuliyun of Western Civilization, looking at the key thinkers of Western civilization over 2,500 years from the ancient Greeks. So up until the collapse of the Bronze Age and the rise of ancient Greek thinkers, obviously Plato, Aristotle, and so on and so forth, and how they all emanate from the questions raised by Socrates, or at least Plato's narrations of Socrates, to all the way to Bertrand Russell, the beginning of early 20th century, because we kind of discussed his book, The History of Western Western Civilization, or Western Philosophy to be more exact. Then there's a second course, which was because many people wanted more discussion on the political schools of thought in the West and in the Enlightenment. So I called it the Madahib of Western civilization, where we look at classical liberalism, social liberalism, and how it arose, its depth, detail, the issues that led to its arising, libertarian kind of pushback in social liberalism, rise of fascism, neo-Marxist or post-Marxist philosophies that emerge from a neo-Marxist perspective, Marxism itself, socialism, which is not the same as Marxism, and then social democracy, a whole number of different schools of thought that arose in the West, all about the issue of equality, about freedom, what does it mean to be free and liberal, particular policies, and the madahib within the madahib, right? So a conservative, right? Are you a social conservative, fiscal conservative, neo-conservative, paleo-conservative, and it's not to do with diet. All this different. So there's madahib within madahib, schools of thought within schools of thought. So I discussed. We did a kind of a 10-week course with a course book and tutorials and things like that. And so if anyone wants to try to at least kind of look into that and sign up for it, we have, if you just go to the Quran with a Q, it's Quran, so the Quran, one word, institute, so www.thequran.institute. You can sign up there. I also wanted to tell people that, not related to this, but I think it's also very important, the Quran Institute is producing it's called a Meron Nisa project for giving support for Muslim women, a community in a way for Muslim women in the UK, in London, but inshallah it will be expanding, where they'll have support for getting fiqh from sisters who are ulama, from kind of health trainers and education, and a whole number of things designed for Muslim women to have a sense of community amongst themselves, access to Islam, deeper knowledge of Islam, and actual practical advice and counseling using Islamic fiqh by sisters who are qualified ulama. So this is something quite needed. So just please check that out on Meron Nisa. So it's MEHRO 2 N's ISA, meronnisa.co.uk, as well to benefit and access from that. And anyway, I think I'd like to just thank Brother Sabor for obviously inviting me. And I want to kind of finish up on I think two points which I think I've kind of come out from this discussion the most, at least one of them the most, which is so really theory versus practice. Me discussing with Dr. Graham Oppy. When he mentioned Ottomans and various issues of Muslim history, I used to engage with it and spend time detailing. Well, this was a rebellion that happened. The Ottomans were actually just responding to an actual military rebellion or a fight. But in essence, there were things that Muslims did in the past which are not from the Islamic rubric. And I'm not here to defend Muslims. I'm here to defend Islam and advocate for it. So I made you could say, a tactical choice to really just make a general response rather than kind of wasting precious time, because there's an opportunity cost, a time opportunity cost, where I could be saying other things. And so I decided to say, look, I'm not here to discuss Muslims. I'm here to discuss Islam. And we have the Medinan model, which is the gold standard for Muslims to refer to. And why is it the gold standard? And why does liberalism not have a particular golden standard at all? It has fiat currency. Paper money, right? Or monopoly money at best, to borrow a term that I heard Sabor once mention to me, right? About someone's argument. So is that we believe that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the messenger of the Creator. His very actions, his edicts, his teachings all represent revelation from the Creator of the universe. There is no other basis for ethics, morality, purpose, or then revelation, of course. And we also have the Quran, the direct message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to us, the word of God. So when we have this as a basis, even if every Muslim after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam wasn't Muslim, let's just say, right? Even if it was only the Prophet Muhammad was the only Muslim, it wouldn't negate in the slightest the moral authority, the ethical authority of the basis of the Quran and Sunnah. Now, sure, we can have disagreement as to whether hadith is authentic or not, or what have you, but because we take it en masse, all these different narrations said by so many people, that on the big topics, there is so much agreement we have. You Muslims listen to this, you should be thankful. You should say, Alhamdulillah, you have no idea how much agreement we have amongst ourselves compared to others. You're so focused on, you zoom in on the disagreements, you think that's all, that we disagree on everything. No, we actually don't. We agree on so many things, more than any religion, any of the majority religions, and all of the political philosophies out there. We have so much consistency and agreement amongst ourselves on the most core things. So for us, it's the theory. Only you could say it's the theory and practice of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Quran. Although he was the practice of the Quran. He was the Quran walking, as Aisha anha described him. Everyone else after him has there's no basis for authority, with the exception of the ijma of the Sahaba, the consensus of all his companions after him. So they all agreed on something. This is a basis taken by many schools of thought in Islam, but that's it. That's absolutely it. Everything else is things which are built upon those bases, whether it is qiyas or using analogical reasoning, or many other different things that are added onto that are kind of employed as tools afterwards. This remains our central basis. And you might say, well, isn't there not infinite types of interpretations you can have of the Quran and Sunnah? Well, no. I mean, tell me how many give me an interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah that says there's two gods. Give me an interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah that says zina is totally fine. Right? Yeah, go have at it. Go eat pork. Yeah. You're not going to find those interpretations. You know that riba is halal. At least there's a debate as what is riba, but at least is riba halal? No one's going to say it is halal. And of course, we have narrations from the Prophet Muhammad describing what it is: the exchange of two like commodities, but with increase, right? With increase when you're in the return exchange, right? So we have all this set out, and if you look at all the four Sunni schools of thought, the three Shi'i schools of thought, the Ibn Hazm school, and a few other schools of thought that are out there, there is a great deal of concordance. Even the Mu'tazila actually agree on the political Sharia. They just had disagreements on issues of ghaib or issues of like what qadar al-qadar, but on the political aspects of the Sharia, they agreed. Even though they negated ahad narrations as they thought it wasn't definite, but they believed, using their Greek influenced logic at times, that the political aspects of the Sharia, the laws and so on, were preserved by mass communication and practice of the community, right? And hence that's the basis for why they would adopt it. So these are things that most people don't realize. So there's our theory and practice. What about liberals? Well, the very fact that Graham Oppy, in essence, himself can't agree with other liberals as to what is liberalism, it really proves my point. Who's to say what is liberalism? You can say John Locke all you want, but John Locke isn't a prophet, right? And what did in my debate with what's his name, O'Connor? Something O'Connor now.
Alex
O'Connor. That's it. A bit later now. He just said, well, we don't have to agree with everything that John Locke says. It's like, exactly, you don't have to agree with anything he says. You don't have to agree with anything that John Stuart Mill says, but you can't deny that if you take anything from these guys, that they had other stuff they said in those exact same books, using exact same consistent formulas they used. They were consistent with their formulas, and that consistency led them to make other judgments with those formulas when they apply those formulas consistently across the board. Yeah. Right. Even though the formulas are not really consistent, right? But anyway, so that's why liberalism ultimately, a French lawmaker can ban your hijab, ban niqab, and say we are liberal. It just as equally as a gun-toting Second Amendment American can say it's liberal, and a a anti-gun abolitionist a British person can say they're liberal, all at the same time, and they're all equally valid, because there's no God of liberalism, there's no prophet of liberalism, and there certainly is no holy book for liberalism. And the last, and that's basically it. So, but I'll finish up with one little question. It's actually a very small one. Someone said, can you elaborate on the argument I once made, and it wasn't in this debate, where I said, given that we didn't create ourselves, how do we own ourselves? And I like this question because it reminded me of something I actually didn't mention in the debate, which is liberalism has another ontological commitment, which I didn't mention in this particular debate, which is that everyone owns themselves. You own yourself. Where in nature did you own yourself? You didn't make yourself. What does it mean to own? What atom of your body owns another atom of the body, right? If you truly think about it, what is it of yourself that owns something of yourself? Does this hand own the other hand? Are you not allowed to cut one of your hands off because it would be against the right of that hand to be part of the same body as the left hand? I mean, it's because we're just particles, right? We're just atoms and so on. What does it even mean to have any kind of ownership over ourselves when we didn't create ourselves, and we certainly didn't decide our tastes, what we like, our language, where we are born into, a whole number of things? What part of ourselves do we actually own? So liberalism starts with that premise, that we are owners of ourselves and we are sovereign. There's nothing sovereign, meaning there's nothing higher over you than yourself. And the only thing that can be is if you give consent to a government to rule on your behalf, and then they can have some control over you, but it has to be limited by the good, right? What is good for you, by your consent, i.e. by you voting. So these are the issues of liberalism. That wasn't, liberalism can't justify that ontology, can't justify that. And these are the issues that I think have been raised in the debate and in the discussion. And I think that I ask all of you to please research, go out, investigate further, because this debate is only a teaser. And I think that I'm glad Dr. Oppy agreed to it. And inshallah, I want to see more Muslims engaging in liberalism debates or discussions, even on a one-to-one level or what have you, because ultimately that's the basis of that, is their deen. The deen, liberalism is a deen, is a way of life for them, and it's the basis behind all their judgments, their viewpoint to things and value judgments. So, khair, inshallah.
Absolutely. I just wanted to add, I think a good way of ending this stream is related to a post you put up probably about a week ago, and it was in regards to if we do not allow Muslims to have Islam as an ideology that they'll be politically active for, because young people want to make a change in the world. They want to, deal with oppression. They want to use their energy and their youth for this positivity, for positive causes in the world. Then they will go to these ideologies, apart from Islam, which are obviously ontologically contradict Islam, and then they'll slip into these types of disbeliefs. And why that's important is because I was kind of thinking back to when I was 16, 9/11 just happened, and then the war on terror happened, and certain things took place, and all you would pretty much hear from masajid and other Muslims who were sort of practicing is almost like, and you even find this today in terms of the world and the political issues that are happening. You find people are almost talking and giving khutbahs and talks and lectures in a way that they would give them a century ago or 2 centuries ago. You couldn't tell the difference, that the world is actually, certain actions are taking place in the world. And when I actually saw that actually there are some Muslims who are speaking on this topic, they're using Islam first and last as their ideology, even though I wasn't even a practicing Muslim at the time. It helps you build an identity. It helps you build a very strong identity, which leads you to actually practicing Islam later on. And how can you think of Islam from that political perspective if you don't even understand what is Islam in contrast to others, which is why I think one of the things I like about what you've been doing over the last at least a decade or so is really understanding the madhabs of Western philosophies, because we have to understand the other side, right? In the same way that in our own creed, we have to understand the deviants, and as a way to understand our own creed. So likewise, when it comes to political, philosophy, we need to understand the other side. So, I'd really like to thank you for the work that you do, and inshallah, we'll have you back in the future for maybe some other topics that you also speak about. Is there any other last message you want to give before we end?
Basically, there's a hadith from the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is a man is upon the deen of his companions. When your neighbors are liberal, you live in a liberal society, or even in the Muslim world with NGOs or spreading liberalism, or the state trying to bring more and more liberal policies because at the behest of their Western masters, or even just the internet, and everyone has access to Western movies and culture. If you choose to be passive, eventually you or your children or your family or your friends will imbibe by even osmosis ideas, values, and so on and so forth. At the very least, engaging in Islamic, kind of political activism, even in the West, not necessarily to change the West into an Islamic government, but really just making public to the Muslim world the errors and the problems and the social issues and the economic problems and issues and inconsistencies in the Western civilizations, its culture, its ideology, and making that available to the Muslim world. Like, look at this. We're engaged. We live here. We've seen the issues here, and we're engaging them. And look at the best that they can argue, and look at how they can't deal with these. They can't have solutions to these problems. Why do you want to implement this over there? And inshallah, why don't you take some heart in your own way of life, rediscover it, relearn it, and apply it, and see how is actually the most enlightened and wisest approach to these issues, both in this life and the next. That if we're not busy countering and engaging and giving and inviting people to our way of life, people will be inviting us to theirs.
Yep.
And it's the silent one loses. The silent one always loses. So that's sorry?
Silence is consent, even in Islam.
Yeah, silence is consent. So if you give dawah, in a way that you try to present Islam as liberal or not, or the Islamic law as not being illiberal, and you try to re-understand it, you're conceding the ground to liberalism, and it wins by default. And eventually, you might think, well, what's wrong? Well, what will be the ramification of that? It will be, well, essentially, when Muslims become like what happened to many liberal Christians, and they think it's all about euphemisms of love, peace, and so on, and freedom, when it's really not. Then they open up the Quran, like the Christians open up the Bible again, and they say, oh, wait a second, it says some really stuff here that's really not very liberal. And if it's the creator of the universe, surely he would have been, if he was liberal, he'd be more clearer about his liberalism. So if this text is not saying the liberal things in a clear way, then, and liberalism is the truth, is correct and just, then Islam or Christianity must be false.
Yeah.
Right. And that's how they become apostates. That's how they leave Christianity, how they left Islam, how they left Judaism. And that's the future that awaits our children if we surrender the ground now. But if we actually say, well, wait a second, not only is Islam not liberal, but thank God it isn't. Because look at the problems of liberalism, and look how superior the solutions of Islam are, how they understand human nature far better. The hikmah, the wisdom, you can present the wisdom of Islam. Look how it understands the fitrah of humans better. Look how it makes consistent sense in itself and how it's consistent with human beings. Look how inconsistent liberalism is internally and how it's inconsistent with human beings. That's the basis of our dawah. And if we're so busy inviting others to our deen, there'll be no time for us to be invited to their deen, so to speak. Right? Even though we're open to engagement, discussion, debate, and listening very carefully and intently to everything that they want to say, but we'll be coming in from the uppermost, as the Quran says. We should be we should be coming in from the uppermost position, and not from a kind of defeated or intellectually inferior position. So what I'll say is, please do check out the courses. If you go to the debate itself and see the description, there's a link there. Please click on that link to check out the courses I did on Usuliyun and Madahibs. And I'll also say I'm going to embarrass a mutual friend of ours. So I know that in England, the person that first engaged in debates on liberalism, I mean, I know that there was a group called Hizb ut-Tahrir that used to engage the liberal economic system, capitalism, they called it before. But the first brother I know of, and do correct me, the first brother I know of that actually engaged liberalism in public debate with liberalism and engaged intellectuals was our mutual friend and brother Hamza Zortzis. And mashallah, he actually was a pioneer in engaging in liberal debates. And then I came in a few years afterwards to do my first liberal debates. And then after that, mashallah, we've seen other public speakers engaging it, but not as much as I think should be. But inshallah, as I said, we can continue. But it's something that I want Muslims to get more involved in, because in this day and age, there's a battle between which is the best way of life for mankind. So we as Muslims get to decide, with Allah, obviously Allah's decision of being the control of all things, but we are the Muslims. It's up to us to decide or to see whether that will be answered as liberalism or as Islam, and that depends on whether on Allah's permission, of course, and on the activity we choose to place in it. So barakallahu feekum, Brother Sabur, for inviting me. I look forward to our further discussions, and barakallahu feekum to all the attendees today, and commentators and questioners and so on. So
Jazakallah khair, everybody, for watching, and Jazakallah khair, Abdullah, as well, for your time. Apologies, we didn't take in live audience questions. It was just too much to discuss. It was planned for 2 hours. It went on because it just had to. But definitely going to be bringing back Brother Abdullah in terms of some of the other things. I mean, I'm sure everybody remembers we still need to do a breakdown of the Oxford debate. I'm sure maybe we can do that in SC Dawah, I don't know. And also I was thinking about the patriotism discussion at the Oxford Union and that's relation to the Dawah. I think that's also something that we can cover in the future. So until next time, everybody, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi